Before we begin our long, perhaps overly detailed walk through the dust of the Bronze Age, I'd like to invite you to settle in. Dim the lights. Adjust your pillow to that one specific angle that actually supports your neck. We're going to be here for a very long time, and the fall of a civilization is best viewed from a position of total physical comfort. There is no rush. The walls of Troy took 10 years to fall, and we have nowhere else to be. Let's just breathe. Let the modern world fade into the background and drift back to a time when gods were petty and geography was destiny. Troy. It was a city that sat on a hill, overlooking the Hellespont, minding its own business and collecting what we might call excessive tolls from passing merchants. It was wealthy, it was fortified, and in the grand scheme of the universe, it was doomed because a few residents of Mount Olympus were bored and lacked healthy coping mechanisms. To understand the fall, we have to understand the beginning, which wasn't a military strategy, but a beauty pageant. Imagine, if you will, a golden apple. It was inscribed with the words, "To the fairest," a phrase specifically designed to ruin a perfectly good afternoon. Eris, the goddess of strife, threw this apple into a wedding feast because she wasn't invited. It was a classic move. Instead of just sending a passive-aggressive regrets card, she decided to destabilize the Mediterranean. 3 goddesses immediately claimed the apple: Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite. They couldn't settle it themselves because despite being immortal beings with cosmic power, they still cared deeply about the validation of a mortal man. That man was Paris. At the time, Paris was living as a shepherd, which was a significant step down from his actual status as a prince of Troy. His father, King Priam, had sent him away because of a prophecy that Paris would cause the city to burn. It's funny how people in myths always try to avoid prophecies by doing the exact thing that makes the prophecy come true. So, Paris is sitting on a hillside, probably bored with his sheep, when 3 goddesses appear before him. They didn't ask him to judge their character or their wisdom, they offered bribes. Hera offered him power over Europe and Asia, which sounds like a lot of paperwork. Athena offered him wisdom and skill in war, which Paris, being a young man with questionable priorities, found uninteresting. Aphrodite, however, offered him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. The woman in question was Helen. There was just one small, inconvenient detail. Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. But Paris, displaying the kind of long-term thinking usually reserved for toddlers, chose Aphrodite's offer. He took the apple, he took his royal title back, and he set sail for Sparta. Menelaus, meanwhile, was a man who probably just wanted a quiet life. He welcomed Paris into his home with the traditional Greek laws of hospitality, which basically meant you couldn't kill your guests even if they were being incredibly annoying. Paris repaid this kindness by waiting until Menelaus left for a funeral in Crete and then vanishing with Helen. Whether she went willingly or was caught in a divine trance is a matter of debate, but the result was the same. A very expensive, very long, and very unnecessary war was about to begin. Elsewhere, in the drafty halls of Mycenaean, Agamemnon received the news of his brother's domestic misfortune. Agamemnon was the kind of man who never let a good crisis to waste, especially if it involved an excuse to invade someone. While Menelaus was genuinely upset about his wife, Agamemnon was mostly looking at the map. Troy controlled the trade routes to the Black Sea, and Agamemnon decided that bringing Helen home was the perfect marketing campaign for a massive imperial expansion.
He sent out the call to all the Greek kings. Because of an old oath, the oath of Tyndareus, nearly every leader in Greece was legally obligated to help Menelaus. It was the Bronze Age equivalent of a fine print contract that everyone signed without reading and now deeply regretted. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, was one of those who tried to get out of it. He was a smart man, perhaps too smart for his own good. When the recruiters arrived, he pretended to be insane by sowing his fields with salt instead of seeds. It was a decent performance until they threw his infant son in front of the plow. Odysseus stopped, proving he was sane, and was promptly handed a spear. It was a rough start to a 20-year business trip. Then there was Achilles. His mother, Thetis, knew that if he went to Troy, he wouldn't be coming back for the holidays. She tried to hide him in a palace on the island of Skyros, dressed as a girl. This worked quite well until Odysseus showed up with a pile of jewelry and one very nice sword. While the other girls looked at the necklaces, Achilles reached for the blade. The disguise was ruined, the prophecy was set, and the fleet began to gather at the port of Aulis. But the gods weren't done being difficult. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, decided she was offended because Agamemnon had killed a deer in a sacred grove and bragged about being a better hunter than her. To show her displeasure, she simply turned off the wind. Thousands of ships sat in the harbor, the sails hanging limp, the soldiers getting sunburnt and bored. The price for a breeze was steep. Agamemnon had to sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. After some initial hesitation, mostly because of how it would look to his wife Clytemnestra, he went ahead with it. The wind returned, the ships sailed, and Agamemnon effectively ensured that his homecoming, years later, would involve a very sharp axe and a bathtub.
As the 1,000 ships finally crested the horizon near the Trojan coast, the residents of the city looked out from their high walls. They had seen merchants and travelers, but they had never seen the entire Greek world coming to their doorstep over a single diplomatic dispute. The Trojans, led by Hector, the only man in this entire story who seemed to have a functioning moral compass, prepared for a long siege. The Greeks landed, but they didn't immediately attack the city. Instead, they realized that Troy's walls were far too thick for their liking. So they did what any frustrated army would do. They started raiding the neighbors. For 9 years, the Trojan War was actually just a series of small-scale robberies and kidnappings in the surrounding countryside. While the empire was slowly crumbling into dust beneath the weight of this endless occupation, the gods were busy managing their own internal grievances. On Mount Olympus, the war was less of a tragedy and more of a long-running reality show that had gone on for too many seasons. Zeus, as usual, tried to remain neutral, which in his case meant letting everyone else do whatever they wanted until he got a headache. Hera and Athena were still fuming about the apple incident. Their grudge against Paris had expanded into a general desire to see the city of Troy erased from the map entirely. Apollo, on the other hand, quite liked the Trojans. He had personally helped build their walls, and he wasn't about to watch his masonry work be demolished without a fight. Aphrodite naturally supported the lovers, mostly because she felt her reputation as a matchmaker was on the line. Down on the beaches, the Greeks were starting to realize that living in tents for a decade was not as heroic as the poems had promised. The camp was a mess of rusty bronze, damp sand, and soldiers who had forgotten why they were there in the first place. Tensions were high, but not between the Greeks and Trojans, between the Greeks themselves. The breaking point didn't come from a tactical blunder, but from a dispute over stolen property. Agamemnon,
demonstrating his singular talent for being unlikable, insulted Achilles by taking a captive woman named Briseis away from him. Achilles, who was essentially a demigod with the emotional stability of a teenager, reacted by retreating to his tent and refusing to fight. He sat there, playing his lyre and watching his friends die, simply to prove a point. Without their star player, the Greek army was suddenly much less imposing. The Trojans took notice. Hector, seeing the Greeks bickering on the sand, decided it was time to move the fight away from the city walls and down to the ships. For the first time in years, the battle became exciting, which was exactly what the gods wanted. Arrows began to fall like rain, guided by divine hands that seemed to find gaps in armor with suspicious frequency. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, and, depending on which historian you ask, perhaps much more, couldn't stand to watch the Greeks be pushed back into the sea. He begged Achilles to return. When Achilles refused, Patroclus did something foolish. He put on Achilles' famous armor, hoping to scare the Trojans into thinking the great hero had returned to the field. It worked for a while. The Trojans saw the shining bronze and panicked, but Patroclus wasn't Achilles. He lacked the divine reflexes and the invulnerability. Hector found him near the dusty plains, and with a single spear thrust, the deception was over. As Patroclus lay dying in the dirt, he warned Hector that his own end was coming, a spoiler alert that Hector chose to ignore. When the news reached the tent of Achilles, the silence was more terrifying than any war cry. The hero's grief wasn't a quiet affair, it was a cosmic event. He didn't just want revenge, he wanted to break the world that had allowed Patroclus to die. Elsewhere, in a drafty palace where the torches flickered low, the Olympian gods watched as Achilles re-entered the fray. His return was not a moment of gallant heroism, but a cold, mechanical march towards inevitable slaughter. He had new armor, forged by Hephaestus himself, because apparently, when you are a demigod in a crisis, the god of fire will personally handle your blacksmithing needs. The shield was so detailed, it practically contained the entire history of the world, which was a bit much for a piece of defensive equipment, but that was the Bronze Age for you. Achilles didn't just fight, he systematically dismantled the Trojan army. He was so efficient that he actually clogged the nearby river Scamander with bodies. The river god, understandably annoyed by the sudden lack of water flow, tried to drown Achilles in a fit of aquatic rage. It was one of those rare moments where the geography itself tried to stop the war, but even a sentient river was no match for a man who had decided he was done with existence. Hector, standing at the gates of Troy, watched his men retreat. He knew the situation had shifted from protracted siege to existential catastrophe. Despite the pleas of his parents, Priam and Hecuba, who watched from the walls with the quiet desperation of people who knew their dynasty was ending, Hector stayed outside. He was the city's last line of defense, a man burdened with the responsibility of being the only adult in a room full of impulsive deities. The confrontation between Achilles and Hector was not the epic duel of legends. It began with Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, turning and running. He ran around the walls of his own city 3 times, chased by a man who was no longer entirely human. The gods looked on, making bets. Zeus held up his golden scales, and Hector's side sunk. It was a bureaucratic end to a heroic life. Eventually, Achilles caught him, aided by a bit of divine trickery from Athena, who disguised herself as Hector's brother to give him a false sense of security. It was a low move, even for her. When the spear finally found its mark, Achilles didn't offer a warrior's respect. He tied Hector's body to the back of his chariot and dragged it through the dust, circling the city, while the Trojans watched in a state of hollow, silent shock. For 12 days, Achilles abused the corpse of his enemy, a grim, repetitive cycle of anger that served no purpose, a preview of the emptiness that follows the fall of a great power. Eventually, King Priam, ancient and broken, had to sneak into the Greek camp at night to beg for his son's body. He kissed the hands that had killed his children, a gesture so pathetic and human that it finally broke Achilles' trance of rage.
The two men ate together in silence, a king who had lost everything and a hero who had nothing left to win. They agreed on a truce for the funeral, a brief pause in the destruction where both sides could pretend, just for a moment, that the world wasn't ending. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Greek camp, Odysseus was thinking. While the other kings were busy polishing their armor or arguing about who had the most impressive scars, Odysseus was contemplating the sheer, exhausting futility of trying to knock down a wall with a spear. 10 years had passed. The Greek soldiers had aged into tired, sun-baked men who missed their wives and their goats. The ships were rotting, and the glory of the war had long since evaporated into the salty air. Odysseus realized that the Trojans would never lose a fair fight at their gates because the walls were divine masonry and the defenders were fighting for their homes. To win, the Greeks didn't need more muscle. They needed a lie so grand and so absurd that the Trojans would actually help them destroy their own city. The plan was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The Greeks spent weeks building a massive, hollow wooden horse. To the average observer, it was a strange choice for a military craft, but they labeled it as an offering to Athena, a parting gift for a safe journey home. Then they burned their camp. They packed up their remaining tents, loaded the ships, and sailed just out of sight behind the nearby island of Tenedos. The next morning, the Trojans woke up to a silence they hadn't heard in a decade. The dust had settled, the screaming had stopped, the horizon was empty of Greek masts. When they opened the gates and walked down to the beach, they found nothing but charred remains of the camp and one giant, silent horse. The Trojans were naturally suspicious because why wouldn't they be? A man named Sinon, left behind by the Greeks as a plant, gave a performance worthy of a modern award. He claimed the Greeks had tried to sacrifice him for a fair wind home, and that the horse was a sacred object. If the Trojans brought it inside their walls, he whispered, they would become the masters of the world. There were warnings, of course. Laocoon, a priest of Poseidon, famously remarked that he feared the Greeks even when they brought gifts. He even threw a spear at the horse's wooden flank, which produced a hollow metallic clank that should have been a very obvious red flag. But the gods, ever the fans of a good disaster, sent 2 massive sea serpents to strangle Laocoon and his sons right there on the sand. The Trojans interpreted this as divine punishment for insulting the horse, rather than what it actually was, a cover-up. Even Cassandra, the daughter of Priam, who was cursed to see the future but never be believed, screamed herself hoarse. She told them the horse was full of armed men. She told them the city would burn by dawn. The Trojans just looked at her with that polite, strained pity you give to someone who has clearly lost their mind. They tore down a section of their own impenetrable wall just to fit the horse inside. It was a tedious, sweaty effort,
a literal labor of self-destruction. Once the horse was in the heart of the city, the Trojans threw the largest party in a generation. They drank wine that hadn't been touched in years. They danced until their feet were sore. They celebrated their victory with the kind of reckless abandon that only comes to people who have forgotten that their enemies were professionals. As the city finally drifted into a heavy, drunken sleep, the air turned cold. The trap was set. Elsewhere, in the pitch-black interior of the wooden belly, Odysseus and a handful of Greece's most patient warriors sat in absolute silence. It was a cramped, uncomfortable space, smelling of pine sap and the unwashed sweat of men who had been sitting in a box for hours. Every time a drunken Trojan leaned against the outside of the horse, or a stray celebratory spear clattered against its side, the men inside held their breath, clutching their swords as if the sound of their own hearts would give them away. They waited for the sounds of the city to change, from the raucous music of a festival to the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a population that had collectively passed out from too much wine. Finally, the signal came. Sinon, the Greek plant who had played his role to perfection, crept to the outskirts of the city and lit a beacon. Out at sea, the Greek fleet, which had merely been hiding behind the curve of Tenedos, saw the flame and began their silent midnight row back to the Trojan shore. Inside the horse, Odysseus signaled for the trapdoor to be opened. The descent was quiet. The warriors slid down ropes, their feet hitting the pavement of the Trojan square with a soft thud. The city was defenseless. The guards at the gates were either dead or snoring, their spears cast aside in the grass. Odysseus and his men moved like shadows, unbolting the massive gates and opening the city to the thousands of Greeks who were now pouring off their ships and marching through the breach the Trojans had made for the horse. What followed was not a battle, but a mechanical erasure of a civilization. The Trojans woke up not to the sound of trumpets, but to the smell of smoke and the sound of their own doors being kicked in. There was no time for them to reach for their armor. King Priam, who had lived through 50 sons, was killed at his own altar, a final messy indignity for a man who had once been the most powerful ruler in the East. The treasures of Troy, the gold that sparked the war, and the artifacts that had stood for centuries were packed into crates with the efficiency of a moving company. The temples were stripped. The great library, such as it was ignored in favor of more portable wealth. The gods, who had spent 10 years arguing over this city, now watched in a sort of bored silence as the fire took hold. Their game was over. The board had been cleared. Helen, the woman whose face had supposedly launched these 1,000 ships, was found in the ruins. Menelaus approached her with his sword drawn, intent on finishing the job he started a decade ago. But according to the snarkier historians of the time, she simply looked at him, perhaps adjusted her hair, and his resolution evaporated. He dropped his sword, took her by the hand, and led her back to his ship. After 10 years of blood and ash, the original dispute was settled with a shrug and a quiet walk to the harbor. As the sun began to rise, it didn't reveal a city, but a black scar on the hillside. The smoke rose in a single straight pillar into the morning air. The Greeks didn't linger. They had what they came for.
And they were tired. They loaded the captives, the gold and the bronze, into their ships and began the long, difficult journey back to a Greece that had moved on without them. While the smoke of Troy was still drifting across the Aegean Sea, the Greek kings realized that winning a war and getting home were two very different problems. The gods,
who had been entertained by the siege, were now deeply offended by the lack of gratitude shown during the city's destruction. In their haste to loot, the Greeks had knocked over a few too many altars and insulted a few too many temples. Athena, who had been their greatest champion, was now their most dangerous obstacle. The voyage home, known as the nostoi, became a slow, agonizing process of attrition. It was as if the universe itself was trying to balance the scales for the blood spilled at Troy. Agamemnon made it back to Mycenaean relatively quickly, only to find that his wife, Clytemnestra, had spent the last decade nursing a very specific grudge regarding their sacrificed daughter. He walked into his palace expecting a hero's welcome, and instead found himself caught in a net in a bathtub, facing a woman with a very sharp axe. His empire didn't end with a battle, but with a messy domestic dispute in a damp room. Menelaus and Helen were blown off course to Egypt, where they wandered for 8 years, arguably having more interesting adventures there than they ever had in Sparta. They eventually settled back into a quiet, awkward domesticity, where they spent their evenings reminiscing about the war, as if it were a particularly stressful vacation they once took. But it was Odysseus who had the longest journey of all. His trip home to Ithaca took 10 years, the same length of time as the war itself. He spent his days fighting one-eyed giants, escaping from islands populated by goddesses who wanted to keep him as a pet, and listening to the songs of sirens that promised him knowledge he didn't actually want. His story became a long, rhythmic cycle of losing his crew, losing his ships, and eventually drifting alone on a raft, a king of nothing but his own survival. Back in Troy, the silence was absolute. The city didn't just fall, it disappeared from the map. Over time, the grass grew over the charred stones, the harbor silted up, and the Hellespont moved its course. The descendants of the survivors wandered off into the hills of Anatolia or sailed west toward Italy, carrying with them the stories of a great city that once stood on a hill. For centuries, Troy became a myth, a bedtime story told to children to warn them about the dangers of beauty and the pettiness of gods. People forgot that it was a real place with real merchants and real taxes. It became a ghost, a legendary warning about the fragility of civilization and the ironic way that empires tend to destroy themselves from the inside out. The Bronze Age itself was winding down. The fall of Troy was just one of many dominoes. Across the Mediterranean, other palaces were burning, other trade routes were being cut, and the great empires of the Hittites and the Egyptians were feeling the cold breath of a changing world. Elsewhere, in the ruins of a once great library where the scrolls had turned to ash, the memory of Troy began its long, slow transformation into legend. The actual events, the logistics of supply lines, the spread of camp fever, and the tedious negotiations over grain were forgotten. In their place, the poets began to weave a tapestry of divine intervention and superhuman feats. It was much easier for the survivors to blame a golden apple or a goddess's whim than to admit their civilization had collapsed because of a series of catastrophic diplomatic blunders and a really poorly timed party. The fall of Troy acted as a grim curtain raiser for what historians now call the Bronze Age collapse. It wasn't just one city that vanished, it was an entire way of life. The complex international trade networks that brought tin from the far west and copper from the east began to fray. Without the ingredients for bronze, the world's most advanced armies were suddenly holding very expensive, very brittle sticks. The great kings of the era, who had spent decades writing polite, passive-aggressive letters to each other, calling one another brother, found themselves presiding over empty treasuries and starving populations. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces, those massive fortress-like structures where the kings of the Trojan War had once stored their looted gold, were burned to the ground. No one is entirely sure who did it. Some say it was an invasion of sea peoples, a mysterious group of displaced wanderers who moved through the Mediterranean like a slow-motion tidal wave. Others suggest it was internal revolt. The peasants finally decided they were tired of paying for their kings' 10-year overseas adventures. Whatever the cause, the lights went out across the Aegean. Literacy vanished. The art of writing in Linear B, the complicated script used to keep track of how many sheep the king owned, was forgotten because there were no longer any kings worth counting for. Greece entered a dark age, a 400-year period of quiet, rural stagnation where people lived in small huts on the ruins of giant palaces, wondering who the gods were that could have built such massive walls. Meanwhile, further south in the scorching heat of the Nile Delta, the Egyptian Empire was watching the chaos of the north with a mixture of practiced indifference and growing anxiety. Egypt was a civilization that measured time in dynasties rather than decades, and to them, the Greeks were loud, upstart barbarians with a strange obsession for wooden horses. But even the pharaohs, who considered themselves living gods, couldn't ignore the fact that the world was getting significantly darker and much more violent.
Ramses III was currently sitting on the throne, dealing with a problem that no amount of prayer to Amun-Ra seemed to solve. The Mediterranean was vomiting up a group of people known as the Sea Peoples. They weren't an army in the traditional sense. They were a migration, a desperate, hungry mass of refugees and warriors who had already dismantled the Hittite Empire in what is now Turkey. They arrived in ships, their families and furniture following in ox carts, looking for a place that wasn't currently on fire. The Egyptians fought them in the marshes of the Delta. It was a messy, humid affair involving archers and hand-to-hand combat in the reeds. Ramses managed to win, mostly by trapping the enemy ships in the shallow waters and raining arrows down upon them. But it was a Pyrrhic victory. Egypt had survived, but it was exhausted. The effort of defending the borders had drained the treasury, and for the first time in history, the pharaoh couldn't pay his tomb builders. This led to the world's first recorded labor strike. The artisans at Deir el-Medina, the men responsible for carving the eternal resting places of the gods, simply put down their tools. They were hungry, the grain shipments were late, and they decided that immortality could wait until lunch was served. It was a subtle, quiet sign that the absolute authority of the pharaoh was beginning to fray at the edges. While the empire was still standing, it was becoming a shadow of its former self. The great buildings were still there, the Nile still flooded, but the spirit of the age had changed. The trade routes were dead. The cedar wood from Lebanon, the incense from Punt, and the tin from the north had all stopped arriving.
Egypt began to turn inward, becoming a closed, paranoid society obsessed with its own past. They spent the next few centuries in a slow, prestigious decline. They were like an elderly aristocrat living in a crumbling mansion, selling off the family silver just to keep the lights on. Priests became more powerful than kings, and the local governors began to treat their provinces like personal fiefdoms. The unity of the two lands was becoming a polite fiction. The gods of Egypt, much like the gods of Troy, seemed to have moved on to other interests, or perhaps they were simply tired of the constant demands for intervention in a world that refused to be stable. The temples remained cool and dark, filled with the scent of old incense and the sound of chanting, but the political reality outside was increasingly chaotic. Elsewhere, in a small village on the coast of the Levant, a group of survivors was learning how to smelt iron. This wasn't a sudden, grand discovery of technology, but a desperate response to the fact that the bronze supply chain had effectively evaporated. When you can no longer get tin from thousands of miles away because the traders have all been murdered or turned into pirates, you start looking at the common reddish rocks in your own backyard with a new sense of curiosity. Iron was difficult, temperamental, and required much higher heat, but it was everywhere. It was the metal of the underdog, the tool of a world that was no longer interested in the luxury of the Bronze Age. These people, who would eventually be known as the Phoenicians, were the ultimate opportunists of the post-collapse world. While the great empires were busy having emotional meltdowns over their lost glory, the Phoenicians were building better boots. They didn't care about royal dysfunction or dynastic pride. They cared about cedar wood, purple dye made from fermented sea snails, and finding new markets. They became the connective tissue of a broken Mediterranean, slowly restitching the map that the Trojan War and the Sea Peoples had torn apart. They were the ones who took the old, clunky scripts of the past and simplified them into a phonetic alphabet. They didn't need thousands of complex hieroglyphs to record a king's ego. They needed 22 simple shapes to record a shipment of wine. This was the quietest revolution in history. It took the power of literacy away from the elite priests and gave it to the merchants and the sailors. It was a tool for the common man, and it would eventually allow the stories of Troy and the gods to be written down rather than just whispered around campfires. But as the Phoenicians sailed further west, they encountered the remnants of the Old World's ambitions. On the coast of North Africa, legend says they founded Carthage, a city that would one day challenge Rome. It's a recurring theme in this long, sleepy history. The refugees of one collapse seem to plant the seeds for the next great conflict. The Levant itself was a mess of small, bickering kingdoms. The Philistines, whom many historians believe were actually displaced Greeks or sea peoples searching for a new home, had settled on the coast with their iron weapons and their memories of a lost homeland. They were the others in the stories of the Israelites, a constant reminder that the world was now a place of constant low-level friction rather than grand imperial conquests. While these small nations were struggling for a few miles of territory, the true giants of the East, the Assyrians, were beginning to stir in their mountain fortresses. If the Bronze Age was an era of sophisticated aristocratic diplomacy, the Iron Age was going to be an era of calculated, systematic brutality. The Assyrians didn't just want to collect taxes, they wanted to turn the concept of conquest into a professional industry. But for now, the transition was slow. The world was still recovering from its collective exhaustion. The ruins of Troy were being reclaimed by the earth. The Egyptian temples were growing dustier, and the Greek Dark Age was at its deepest point. It was a time of silence, a long historical pause where the only thing moving was the wind over the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, in the rugged, misty fjords of the far north, a different kind of myth was being born. While the Mediterranean civilizations were collapsing under the weight of their own complexity, the people of the north, the ancestors of those we would one day call the Vikings, were living a life of quiet, freezing isolation. Their world was not defined by marble temples or gold-encrusted kings, but by the relentless rhythm of the seasons and the cold, dark waters that carved into their jagged coastline.
The locals, the Latins, were understandably skeptical of these newcomers with their strange accents and their stories of a 10-year war. There were skirmishes, of course, small, dusty battles over grazing rights and marriages, but eventually the two groups began to blend. The Trojan identity started to fade into something new, something Italian. It was a slow, generational erasure. The grand tragedy of Troy became a distant family memory, a story told by grandfathers to explain why they had a slightly different way of carving a spear or praying to the hearth. While these early Romans were busy surviving, they were also absorbing the influences around them. To the north were the Etruscans, a mysterious and highly sophisticated civilization that loved banquets, complex jewelry, and predicting the future by looking at sheep livers. The Etruscans were everything the early Romans were not: wealthy, artistic, and deeply weird. From them, the Romans learned how to build sewers and temples, and more importantly, they learned that if you want to run a successful empire, you need a very thorough bureaucracy. The Roman project was built on a foundation of irony. They claimed to be the descendants of the defeated Trojans, yet they developed a culture obsessed with winning at all costs. They took the Greek gods, stripped away much of the poetic drama, and turned them into practical, civic-minded entities. Zeus became Jupiter, less of a philandering lightning bolt thrower and more of a cosmic CEO. Ares became Mars, who wasn't just a god of bloodlust, but a god of disciplined agricultural and military order. This transition was the beginning of the end for the old world of myths. The Romans were the ultimate pragmatists. While a Greek hero might die for glory, a Roman soldier died for a paycheck and a clot of land for his retirement. They took the chaotic divine energy of the Bronze Age and organized it into a spreadsheet. It was boring, it was repetitive, and it was incredibly effective. As the village on the Tiber grew into a town and the town into a city, the people there began to feel a sense of destiny. They didn't call it that, of course. They probably just called it getting through the winter. But they were building the first truly industrial empire. They weren't interested in a 10-year siege over a single woman. They were interested in a 100-year plan to pave every road in Europe. While the Roman Republic was slowly sharpening its swords and refining its legal codes, the great empires of the East were entering a period of renewed and much more professional violence. The Assyrians had perfected the art of the siege, and they weren't using wooden horses. They were using iron-tipped battering rams and psychological warfare that made the Greeks look like amateurs. Meanwhile, back in Greece, the long Dark Age was finally beginning to lift,
like a fog burning off a morning field. People were starting to rediscover the art of living in groups larger than an extended family. They looked at the massive ruined stones of the Mycenaean palaces and concluded that they must have been built by cyclopses, because the concept of their own ancestors having that much organizational power was literally unthinkable. The Greeks of this new era were different. They had lost the centralized kingship of the Bronze Age and replaced it with the polis, or city-state. It was a fragmented, competitive, and highly argumentative way to run a civilization. Every valley and every island decided it was a sovereign nation, leading to a political landscape that was basically a collection of small-town rivalries with weapons.
But the most important thing they rediscovered was their voice. Around the 8th century BC, they took that simplified Phoenician alphabet and added vowels to it, creating a script that could actually capture the rhythm of human speech. The first things they bothered to write down weren't laws or tax records. They were the stories of Troy. Homer, or whoever the collection of poets we call Homer actually was, took the messy, whispered memories of the fall and turned them into the Iliad and the Odyssey. Suddenly, the war wasn't just a half-forgotten tragedy, it was the foundation of their identity. Every Greek aristocrat wanted to believe they were descended from a hero who had sat inside that wooden horse. It gave them a shared history, a reason to feel superior to everyone else, and a very dangerous sense of pride. They began to hold the Olympic Games, a way to compete without necessarily killing each other, though the line between sport and organized violence remained thin. While the Greeks were busy inventing philosophy and arguing in the marketplace, the Assyrian Empire in the east was demonstrating exactly what happens when you don't spend enough time on philosophy and too much time on siege engines. The Assyrians were the first true war machine. They didn't care about the poetic justice of the gods. They cared about iron production and the systematic deportation of conquered populations. Their capital, Nineveh, was a monument to administrative brutality. The Assyrians were the ones who truly ended the lingering vibes of the Bronze Age. They showed that an empire didn't have to be a loose collection of brother kings sharing gifts. It could be a centralized, terrifying entity that demanded absolute subjection. They were the first to use cavalry on a massive scale, turning the battlefield into a fast-moving, ironclad nightmare. Yet, as history repeatedly proves, the more a system relies on pure terror, the more exhausting it becomes to maintain. The Assyrians were spread thin, their borders constantly nibbled at by nomadic tribes like the Medes and the Scythians. They had built a world where everyone hated them, and eventually, the bill for that kind of foreign policy comes due. Back in Egypt, the pharaohs were watching all of this with a sense of been there, done that. They were currently in their late period, occasionally being conquered by the Assyrians, then the Persians, then the Greeks. They were becoming a museum of a civilization, a place where people went to see things that were already ancient when the Trojan War started. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the Zagros Mountains, a new power was rising that would make the Assyrians look like a minor distraction: the Persians. The Persians were not like the Assyrians. They didn't lead with the whip, but with an offer of terrifyingly efficient integration. Under Cyrus the Great, the Persian Empire began to expand like a slow-moving ink blot across the map of the Near East. Cyrus had a radical idea for the time. He realized
that if you don't burn down people's temples, and if you let them keep their own customs, they're much less likely to stab your tax collectors in the middle of the night. It was a kinder, gentler form of absolute subjugation. The Persians built the Royal Road, a highway system so fast that a message could travel 2,000 miles in 9 days. They created the first true global postal service because, apparently, even in the 6th century BC, people needed their mail delivered on time. They divided their world into satrapies, governed by local officials who were overseen by the king's eyes, imperial spies who made sure everyone was staying on brand. While the Persians were creating the largest empire the world had ever seen, the Greeks were entering what we call their classical age. This was the era of the high-stakes cultural experiment. In Athens, they were playing with the idea of democracy, which mostly involved a lot of shouting in a public square and occasionally voting to kick someone out of the city just because they were too popular. In Sparta, they had doubled down on the warrior lifestyle, creating a society that was essentially a permanent military boot camp where the food was intentionally bad to make the soldiers more eager to die in battle. The collision between these two worlds, the massive, bureaucratic Persian machine and the small, loud, argumentative Greek city-states, was inevitable. It started over a series of tax revolts in Ionia, but it turned into a clash of civilizations that would define the Western imagination for millennia. The Persians viewed the Greeks as a minor nuisance on the edge of the world, like a mosquito that wouldn't stop buzzing during a board meeting. The Greeks viewed the Persians as a mindless, golden-clad horde that threatened their freedom, by which they meant their right to argue with each other without foreign interference. When Darius I sent his fleet to punish Athens at the Battle of Marathon, the result was a shock to the system. The Persian infantry, designed for fast movement on the open plains of Asia, found themselves face to face with the Greek phalanx, a wall of bronze shields and long spears that moved like a slow-motion steamroller. The Persians lost. A runner went for a very long jog to deliver the news, and the myth of Greek military superiority was born. But the Persians were nothing if not persistent. A decade later, Darius's son, Xerxes, decided to do things properly. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, the same stretch of water the Trojans had watched centuries before, and marched an army so large that the poets claimed they drank the rivers dry. This was the War of Thermopylae and Salamis, of the 300 Spartans and the Athenian navy. It was a high-drama conflict that felt like a reboot of the Trojan War, only this time the gods stayed mostly out of it, replaced by the sheer grinding logistics of naval warfare and narrow mountain passes. The Greeks won again, not because they were necessarily better, but because the Persians were fighting thousands of miles from their supply lines in a landscape that hated them. With the Persian threat neutralized, the Greeks did exactly what you'd expect. They immediately started fighting each other. The Peloponnesian War followed, a 30-year grind that turned the Aegean Sea into a graveyard and left the city-states exhausted, bankrupt, and ripe for a takeover. Elsewhere, in the northern highlands of Macedonia, King Philip II was watching the Greek city-states destroy themselves, and he was quietly taking notes. To the sophisticated Athenians, the Macedonians were nothing more than unwashed rustics who drank their wine undiluted, a sure sign of barbarism in the ancient world. But Philip was a man of vision, and more importantly, he was a man who understood the value of a longer spear.
He took the traditional Greek phalanx and gave the soldiers the sarissa, a pike so long that the enemy was usually skewered before they could even see the color of a Macedonian's eyes. He also realized that if you pay your soldiers a professional salary, they tend to spend less time complaining about the harvest and more time practicing their formations. By the time Philip was done, he had turned Macedonia from a backwater into a military juggernaut. Philip eventually forced the Greeks into a league, which was really just a polite way of saying they were now his employees. He had a grand plan to invade Persia, partly for revenge and mostly for the sheer wealth of it. But Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, a messy end for a man who had spent his life dodging spears only to be taken out by a member of his own bodyguard. The crown passed to his 20-year-old son, Alexander. The Greeks thought they could revolt against a mere boy, but Alexander quickly reminded them that he had been tutored by Aristotle and trained by Philip. He destroyed the city of Thebes as a warning, then turned his gaze toward Asia. Alexander's campaign was the ultimate road trip of antiquity. He didn't just defeat the Persians, he dismantled their world. From the Battle of Issus to the Siege of Tyre, he moved with a speed that made the slow, grinding sieges of the Trojan War look like a standstill. He conquered Egypt, where the priests declared him a pharaoh and a son of Ammon, which he likely enjoyed quite a bit. He then marched into the heart of Persia, burning the great palace of Persepolis, perhaps as an act of drunken revenge for the burning of Athens, or perhaps just because the fire looked impressive in the night sky. Alexander reached as far as the Indus River in India before his troops finally looked at him and said no. They were tired, they were homesick, and they had more gold than they could possibly carry. They wanted to go home and spend it. Alexander, in a fit of pique, sulked in his tent for 3 days before finally turning back. He died in Babylon at the age of 32, without leaving a clear heir. When asked who his empire should go to, he allegedly whispered, "To the strongest." It was the worst possible answer. His generals, the Diadochi, immediately began a series of wars that lasted for decades, tearing the map into pieces. While the Greek world was being carved up into the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia, the culture of Greece was being spread like a thin layer of butter over the entire East. Every city from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas suddenly had a gymnasium, a theater, and people arguing about Plato in bad Greek. But while these Greek kings were busy bickering over the ruins of Alexander's dream, a shadow was growing in the west. Rome had finished its local chores in Italy. They had defeated the Etruscans, absorbed the Samnites, and now were looking at the Mediterranean with an appetite that made Alexander look like a light snacker. The Romans didn't have Alexander's flair or his poetic obsession with Homeric heroes. They had something much more terrifying, a system that could lose an entire army today and simply build a new one by Tuesday. Meanwhile, in the ruins of Carthage, a young boy named Hannibal was being made to swear an eternal oath of hatred against Rome. Carthage was a city of merchants, the proud descendants of the Phoenicians who had built a maritime empire that controlled the western Mediterranean like a private lake. They were wealthy, sophisticated, and deeply annoyed by the rising power of the Romans. The First Punic War had already happened, a long and tedious naval conflict that Rome won essentially by refusing to stop building ships even after they kept sinking. Carthage had been humiliated and forced to pay a massive indemnity. Hannibal, the son of the great general Hamilcar Barca, wasn't interested in indemnities. He was interested in the total erasure of the Roman Republic.
His campaign in the Second Punic War remains one of the most absurdly ambitious military feats in history. He didn't attack Rome by sea where they expected him. Instead, he marched an army of North Africans, Spaniards, and Gauls, along with 37 war elephants, over the Alps in the middle of winter. It was a logistical nightmare that should have ended his career before it began. Most of the elephants died, and half of his men froze to death, but when he descended into the Italian plains, the Romans realized they were facing a genius of pure, unadulterated chaos. For 15 years, Hannibal wandered around Italy, winning battle after battle. At Cannae, he performed a double envelopment so perfect that it is still taught in military academies today. He killed 80,000 Romans in a single afternoon. The Roman Senate was in a state of hallowed panic. They began to practice human sacrifice again, a sign that their pragmatism had finally been replaced by sheer existential terror. But here is where the Roman character, the one forged in the aftermath of the Trojan refugees' survival, truly showed itself. Any other nation would have surrendered after Cannae. The Romans simply closed the gates, refused to use the word peace, and drafted every male over the age of 17, including slaves. They realized they couldn't beat Hannibal in a fair fight, so they simply stopped fighting him. They shadowed him, burned the crops before he could reach them, and waited for him to get tired. While Hannibal was stuck in Italy, winning battles but losing the war of attrition, a Roman general named Scipio decided to take the fight to Carthage. He invaded North Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal. At the Battle of Zama, Scipio used Hannibal's own tactics against him. The war ended with Carthage stripped of its fleet, its colonies, and its pride. But the Romans were not known for their mercy. A few decades later, driven by the obsessive chanting of a senator named Cato, who ended every speech with "Carthage must be destroyed," they returned. They didn't just defeat the city, they burned it for 17 days, enslaved the survivors, and supposedly sowed the ground with salt so nothing could ever grow there again. It was a cold, calculated murder of a civilization. With Carthage gone, the Mediterranean was no longer a contested space. It was a Roman lake. They turned their gaze east toward the Hellenistic kingdoms that had been bickering since the death of Alexander. The Greeks, with their beautiful philosophy and their outdated phalanxes, were no match for the Roman legion, a flexible, professional killing machine that moved with the precision of a clock. By the time the dust settled, Rome was no longer a republic of farmers. It was a global superpower, drowning in wealth and slaves. And as history likes to remind us, wealth is often more dangerous than poverty. The Roman Republic began to rot from the top down, as generals like Marius and Sulla realized that an army's loyalty belonged to the man who paid them, not the state. Elsewhere, in a villa overlooking the Bay of Naples, a man named Julius Caesar was beginning to realize that the rules no longer applied to him. Caesar was the ultimate product of the Roman system, brilliant, charming, and possessed by an ambition that made even Alexander's ghost look lazy. He understood that the Roman Republic was a hollow shell, a collection of wealthy aristocrats bickering over a city while the world was theirs for the taking. To fund his climb to the top, Caesar spent 8 years in Gaul, modern-day France, conducting a campaign that was part military conquest and part systematic genocide. He wasn't just expanding the borders, he was creating a personal army that owed its loyalty solely to him. When the Senate, terrified of his power, ordered him to disband his legions and return to Rome as a private citizen, Caesar paused at the edge of the Rubicon. It was a small, shallow river, but crossing it with an army was an act of treason. He crossed it anyway, famously remarking that the die is cast, which was a very dramatic way of saying he was all in on a civil war. The ensuing conflict tore the Roman world apart. Caesar chased his rival Pompey from Italy to Greece and finally to Egypt. In Egypt, Caesar encountered the last remnant of the Greek world, Cleopatra. She was a Ptolemy, a descendant of one of Alexander's generals, and she was currently locked in a deadly sibling rivalry for the throne. Cleopatra didn't just want Caesar's help, she wanted his power. Their alliance was a collision of two dying worlds, the ancient mystical prestige of the pharaohs and the cold rising iron of Rome. While Caesar eventually secured the throne for her, the distraction didn't last long. He returned to Rome as a dictator, but his peers still harbored the old-fashioned idea that kings were a bad thing. On the Ides of March, they stabbed him 23 times in the Senate House, a messy, disorganized attempt to save a republic that was already dead. The assassins, however, had no plan for what came next. They left a vacuum that was filled by Caesar's great-nephew, Octavian, and his general, Mark Antony. These two spent years hunting down Caesar's killers before inevitably turning on each other. The final showdown happened at sea, at the Battle of Actium. Octavian won. Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled back to Egypt to end their lives in a way that felt like a tragic Greek play, and the Roman Republic was officially replaced by the Roman Empire. Octavian, now calling himself Augustus, became the first emperor. He was a master of branding. He didn't call himself a king, he called himself the first citizen, while quietly holding every significant power in the state. He initiated the Pax Romana, a 200-year period of relative peace and extreme boredom for the legions. Under the emperors, Rome reached its peak. They built aqueducts that carried millions of gallons of water, roads that lasted for millennia, and a legal system that treated citizens like data points in a massive imperial experiment. They were the most efficient organization in human history, but beneath the marble and the triumphs, the same rot that destroyed Troy was beginning to fester. The empire was too big, the borders were too long. To maintain the luxury of Rome, they had to constantly tax the provinces, and to tax the provinces, they needed more soldiers. It was a cycle of overhead that couldn't be sustained forever. And as the Roman elite grew softer, the barbarians at the gates were growing harder. Meanwhile, in the cold, dark forests of Germania, the tribes were starting to realize that the Roman wall was not as impenetrable as it looked. The Germans were a collection of fragmented, warlike clans who lived in a world of swamp and timber, a far cry from the heated floors and marble baths of Rome. To the Romans, Germania was a terrifying, unprofitable wasteland. To the Germans, Rome was a giant, aging beast made of gold and iron that had finally stopped growing. The first real crack in the facade happened in the Teutoburg forest. A Roman-educated Germanic chieftain named Arminius, who knew exactly how the Roman military mind worked, lured 3 elite legions into a narrow, muddy trap. Over 3 days, the legions were systematically dismantled by warriors who moved through the trees like ghosts. When the news reached Augustus in his palace, he reportedly wandered the halls, banging his head against the walls and crying out for his lost legions. It was a profound psychological defeat. Rome decided that the Rhine River would be its limit. They built the limes, a series of fortifications that were supposed to keep the chaos out, but walls have a funny way of becoming prisons for the people inside them. As the centuries rolled on, the Roman Empire became a victim of its own success. The currency was debased, the silver and the coins replaced by copper until the money was worth less than the effort of minting it. Emperors were being made and murdered by the Praetorian Guard with the frequency of a seasonal weather change. In one particularly absurd year, the Roman throne was literally auctioned off to the highest bidder, a wealthy senator who realized too late that buying an empire is much easier than keeping your head. To save the sinking ship, the Emperor Diocletian decided to cut the empire in half. He created the tetrarchy, or the rule of four, realizing that one man couldn't possibly manage the bureaucracy from Scotland to the Euphrates. This led to the rise of Constantine, who shifted the capital of the world from the ancient crumbling Rome to the strategically brilliant Constantinople in the east. He also adopted Christianity, turning a persecuted cult of the poor into the official religion of the state. The old gods, Jupiter, Mars, and the spirits of the Trojan ancestors were quietly retired, their temples converted into churches or left to the weeds. While the Eastern Empire, or Byzantium, flourished with its trade and its thick walls, the Western Empire was being carved up like a carcass. The Huns, a nomadic force from the steppes of Asia, were pushing the Germanic tribes across the Roman borders. These weren't just armies, they were entire nations, the Visigoths, the Vandals, the Franks, fleeing a greater terror behind them.
The Goths, once hired as Roman mercenaries, eventually got tired of the corruption and the lack of pay. In 410 AD, for the first time in 800 years, the city of Rome was sacked. It wasn't a total destruction like Troy, but the psychological impact was the same. The eternal city was vulnerable. The Vandals followed a few decades later, looting the city so thoroughly that their name became a synonym for senseless destruction. The end of the Western Roman Empire was not a grand battle, but a quiet administrative shrug. In 476 AD, a Germanic general named Odoacer simply told the last teenage emperor, Romulus Augustulus, to go home and retire. The crown was sent to Constantinople. The Roman world had officially entered its dark age. But while the sun was setting on the Mediterranean, the embers of the old gods were blowing north. The Germanic and Norse tribes were about to take center stage, carrying with them a spirit of raiding and seafaring that would make the old Trojan Wars look like a minor skirmish. Elsewhere, in the icy fjords where the longships were being perfected, the Norsemen were entering a period of frantic, cold-blooded innovation. While the former Roman provinces in the south were busy hiding behind the crumbling stone walls of monasteries, the north was developing a technology that would turn the ocean into a highway. This was the era of the longship, a vessel with a hull so shallow it could sail across an ocean and then, without stopping, row right up a river into the heart of a sleeping village. The Vikings were the final, chaotic echo of the ancient world's warrior spirit. They lived in a world where the gods were not distant bureaucrats like the Roman Jupiter, but active, temperamental forces who rewarded courage and cared very little for mercy. To a Viking, the collapse of the Roman Empire was simply a massive business opportunity. They saw a Europe that was wealthy,
Christian, and, most importantly, unguarded. The raid on Lindisfarne in 933 AD was the Trojan horse moment for medieval Europe. It was a small, quiet island off the coast of England, home to a monastery filled with gold, books, and monks who had never seen a battle axe. When the Northmen landed, they didn't offer a declaration of war or a diplomatic envoy. They simply took what they wanted and left. The shockwaves traveled all the way to the court of Charlemagne. The world realized that the sea, which had once been a barrier of protection, was now a door that could never be locked. While the popular image of the Viking is a man in a horned helmet, which, for the record, they never actually wore, the reality was much more interesting. They were a civilization of explorers and merchants who happened to be exceptionally good at violence. They settled in Russia, founded the city of Kiev, and traveled down the Volga River to trade with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. They found themselves standing in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, where they were so impressed by the local military prowess that they signed up to be the Varangian Guard, the elite axe-wielding bodyguards of the Eastern Roman Emperor. It was a strange, full-circle moment for history. The descendants of the northern tribes who had helped destroy the Western Roman Empire were now the most loyal defenders of the Eastern one. They stood in the great marble halls of the East, looking at the statues of old gods they didn't recognize, carving their names in Norse runes on the balcony of the world's largest church just because they were bored. But the Viking expansion wasn't just about gold, it was about space. They pushed west into the North Atlantic, discovering Iceland and Greenland not through maps, but through the sheer stubborn refusal to turn back. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif Erikson reached a place he called Vinland, the coast of North America. They built a few small timber houses, fought with the locals, and then, in a very typical Norse fashion, decided it was too far away from their friends and went home. The Viking Age ended not with a bang, but with a conversion. Much like the Romans before them, the Norse kings realized that if you want to be part of the civilized world, you have to adopt the civilized religion. They traded their hammers for crosses, their longships for merchant cogs, and their sagas for written chronicles. By the time the 11th century rolled around, the Vikings had become the Normans, French-speaking, Christianized warriors who would soon conquer England and bring an end to the old, fragmented world of the North. As the last longship rotted in the mud of a Scandinavian fjord, the era of the ancient gods had officially ended. The cycle that began with the golden apple of Troy had finally spun itself out. While the world was moving into the Middle Ages, the ruins of the great empires were still there, buried under layers of time, waiting for someone to care enough to dig them up. The Mediterranean had become a graveyard of ghosts. In the desert sands of Egypt, the Great Pyramids were no longer the centers of a living cult, but massive, silent riddles that even the locals had forgotten their true purpose of. In Rome, the Forum, once the beating heart of a global administration, was being used as a cow pasture, its marble columns repurposed to build pigsties or lime kilns. The transition from history to legend was now complete. The stories of the Trojan War, the madness of Caligula, and the voyages of the Vikings had been polished by time into something smooth and unrecognizable. They were no longer accounts of human error and logistical failure. They were moral fables. People looked at the crumbling aqueducts and the overgrown Roman roads and assumed they were the work of giants or sorcerers. The intellectual lights had been dimmed so low that the idea of a centralized state providing clean water to 1 million people felt like a fever dream from a forgotten life. Yet, in the shadows of the monasteries and the dusty corners of the Byzantine libraries, the scrolls survived. Monks who never seen a battlefield spent their entire lives painstakingly copying the words of Homer and Virgil. They didn't always understand the context. They often scrubbed out pagan poetry to write over it with church hymns, but the DNA of the ancient world was preserved in the ink.
This was the era of the great forgetting, but also the great incubation. The fall of Troy, the collapse of the Bronze Age, and the slow rot of Rome had taught a hard lesson that the world wasn't ready to hear again. That civilization is not a natural state, but a fragile, high-maintenance construction. It requires constant attention, and the moment a society begins to believe its own myth of invincibility is the moment the first crack appears in the wall. As the centuries ticked toward the Renaissance, a new generation of thinkers began to look at these ruins not with fear, but with curiosity. They began to realize that the ancients weren't gods or monsters, but people who were just as petty, ambitious, and confused as themselves. They began to dig. They found the statues with their noses broken off, the coins with the faces of forgotten emperors, and the foundations of the walls that Paris and Hector once stood upon. The cycle of empires is a rhythmic, sleepy thing. It rises with a shout and a surge of energy. It plateaus in a long afternoon of luxury and bureaucracy, and it fades in a quiet evening of neglect and ironies. We like to think we are different, that our skyscrapers and our digital clouds are more permanent than the limestone of Troy or the bronze of the legions, but the dust always wins in the end. It's just a matter of how long the gods decide to keep the game going before they flip the board and start over. For now, the story of the fall has reached its temporary conclusion. The empires have crumbled, the gods have gone silent, and the earth has reclaimed its own. The fires of Troy have long since gone out, leaving nothing but a faint, gray ash and a story that refuses to die. While we often focus on the duel between Hector and Achilles, the plains of Troy were actually a magnet for mysterious forces from across the ancient world. It wasn't just a local dispute. It was the first truly global conflict, a Bronze Age world war that drew in kingdoms from the deep south and the mysterious east. King Priam, realizing that his city couldn't survive forever on its own walls, had sent out calls for aid to the very edges of the known world. One of the most striking groups to arrive were the Amazons, led by Queen Penthesilea. These warrior women arrived not out of a love for Troy, but out of a pure mechanical desire for battle. They were the ultimate outliers in a world dominated by patriarchal kings. The Trojans watched from their walls as these women rode into battle with a ferocity that made even the Greek veterans pause. Penthesilea herself was a tragic figure, a woman seeking a warrior's death to atone for an accidental killing in her past. When she finally met Achilles on the battlefield, it wasn't a long, heroic struggle.
Achilles killed her with the same cold efficiency he applied to everyone else. But as he looked at her fallen form, the poets say he felt a flicker of something human, a moment of silent, useless regret in the middle of a slaughterhouse. It was a reminder that even the most legendary killers get tired of the blood eventually. Then there was Memnon, the king of Ethiopia. He arrived with an army that looked unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen. He was described as a son of the dawn, a warrior of incredible beauty and power. Memnon was the African counterpart to Achilles, a hero of equal stature and divine lineage. Their duel was said to be so intense that Zeus himself had to weigh their destinies on his golden scales, while the other gods held their breath. Memnon fell, and with him died the hope that an outside power could tip the scales of the war. These foreign allies weren't just characters in a poem. They represented the vast, interconnected trade and military networks of the Bronze Age. When they fell at Troy, their home kingdoms were left weakened, their best warriors buried in a foreign land for a cause that ultimately failed. This was the hidden cost of the Trojan War. It wasn't just Troy that was crumbling, it was the entire military elite of the Mediterranean and the Near East. The heroic age was literally killing itself off. Every time a great king like Memnon or a queen like Penthesilea fell in the dust, a piece of the world's stability vanished. The gods, of course, watched all this with the same detached interest someone might have while watching an ant farm. They didn't care about the demographics or the economic impact of losing an entire generation of leaders. They just wanted to see who would win the next round. Elsewhere, in the quiet, desperate rooms of the Trojan palace, the women were preparing for a future that had no room for them. While the men were outside playing out their terminal fantasies of glory, the women of Troy, the queens, the daughters, and the servants were the only ones truly seeing the world for what it was. For them, the war wasn't about bronze or honor. It was a slow-motion countdown to a life of displacement. Hecuba, the queen of Troy, sat in the flickering light of her chambers, watching her children disappear one by one. She had given birth to 50 sons, and now the hallways of the palace felt cavernous and haunted. The air in Troy had become heavy with the scent of unwashed wool and the metallic tang of blood that no amount of incense could mask. She knew with the sharp intuition of someone who has survived too much history that the gods had already packed their bags and left the city. Then there was Andromache, Hector's wife. Her life was a study in the cruel mathematics of war. She knew that her husband's bravery actually was a death sentence for her and her infant son, Astyanax. In one of the most heartbreaking scenes in the entire narrative, Hector removes his plumed helmet because it scares his crying child. It's a tiny domestic moment of tenderness in a decade of brutality. A reminder that even the most legendary killers wanted to watch their children grow up.
But the most tragic of all was Cassandra. As we mentioned, she had the gift of prophecy, but the curse of never being believed. Imagine the psychological torture of seeing the Greek ships hiding behind the island, seeing the fire in the rafters, and seeing the cold eyes of the soldiers, all while your family tells you to go lie down and have some water. She was the ultimate witness to the logic of the irrational. She saw the trap, but the Trojans were so addicted to the idea of their own victory
that they treated the truth as a nuisance. When the city finally fell, the fate of these women became the dark epilogue to the Greek victory. They weren't killed, they were divided up like furniture. The high-born ladies of Troy, who had spent their lives in silk and gold, were suddenly being dragged onto Greek ships to serve as domestic workers for the men who had murdered their husbands. It was a brutal, systematic dismantling of a social class. This part of the story is often skipped in the heroic versions, but it's the most important. It shows that the end of an empire isn't just a falling wall or a burning roof. It's the personal, intimate destruction of every family within it. The Greeks thought they were taking prizes, but they were actually taking the trauma of Troy back home with them. This trauma would eventually poison their own kingdoms, leading to the murders and betrayals we saw in the later years of Agamemnon and his peers. The war didn't stay in Troy. It followed the victors home like a shadow. Elsewhere, in the damp, sunless holds of the Greek ships, the prisoners listened to the rhythm of the oars, each stroke carrying them further away from the only world they had ever known. Among them was Briseis, the woman who had inadvertently caused the greatest rift in the Greek army. We often hear of her as a prize of honor, but she was a survivor of a city called Lyrnessus, which Achilles had destroyed before even reaching the walls of Troy. For her, the fall of Troy was just the final act of a long personal apocalypse. The Greeks, meanwhile, were finding that their victory was a very heavy thing to carry. As they sailed away from the smoking ruins of the Scamander Plain, the weather began to turn. The Aegean Sea, which had been their highway for 10 years, suddenly became a hostile, unpredictable god. It was as if the earth itself was trying to wash away the men who had committed such sacrilege against the temples of Troy. During these long, terrifying nights at sea, the Greek soldiers had too much time to think. The adrenaline of the sack had worn off, replaced by the hollow reality of what they had done. They had spent 10 years for a woman who was now sitting calmly on her husband's ship, and in return, they had lost their youth, their friends, and their innocence. The bronze they had looted felt colder and heavier with each passing league. There is a less told story about the little Iliads, the smaller, grittier accounts of what happened to the minor characters. Men like Ajax the Lesser, who had committed the ultimate sin by dragging Cassandra from the altar of Athena, found that divine vengeance was swift. His ship was struck by a lightning bolt, and as he scrambled onto a rock, boasting that not even the gods could kill him, Poseidon simply split the rock with his trident. It was a blunt, mechanical end to a man who thought he was above the rules of the universe. The Greek fleet was scattered. Some ships were blown as far as Libya, others were smashed against the jagged rocks of Euboea. The survivors who did make it back didn't find the parades they expected. They found that 10 years is a long time for a power vacuum to exist. Their wives had remarried, their sons didn't recognize them, and their fields had grown over with weeds. The return of the kings was less of a triumph and more of a series of tragic home invasions. The Mycenaean world was built on the prestige of the warrior king, but when those kings returned broken, haunted, and empty-handed, the social contract began to dissolve. The soldiers, having seen that even the great walls of Troy could fall to a lie, began to wonder why they were taking orders from men who lived in drafty palaces on hills. The Trojan War hadn't just plundered a city, it had broken the psychological foundation of the Bronze Age. The belief that might makes right and that the gods favor the strong had been exposed as a hollow lie. Elsewhere, in the dark, forested mountains of the Peloponnese, the first whispers of a new invasion were beginning to grow. These were not the refined, chariot-driving aristocrats of the Mycenaean age, but a rugged, iron-willed people known as the Dorians. They moved with the cold, slow persistence of a winter storm, descending from the north into a Greece that was too tired and broken from the Trojan War to put up a fight. The Mycenaean kings had spent their resources on a decade-long siege in a foreign land, leaving their own fortresses vulnerable. When the Dorians arrived with their superior iron weapons, the bronze-clad heroes of the Trojan era found themselves outmatched by a new age of technology. The great palaces of Pylos and Mycenae weren't just conquered, they were burned so thoroughly that the stones themselves cracked. The archives of linear bead tablets, the records of their taxes, their grain, and their kings were baked in the fires, preserving the accounts of a world that was literally going up in flames. This period is often called the Dorian invasion, but it was more like a systemic collapse. The survivors of these burning palaces fled to the mountains or crossed the sea to the islands, carrying nothing but their memories. They were the sea peoples that we mentioned earlier, now reduced to refugees looking for any shore that would take them. The sophisticated, interconnected world of the Mediterranean was being replaced by a fragmented, tribal existence. The irony was profound. The Greeks had spent 10 years destroying Troy, only to return home and find their own cities suffering the exact same fate. It was a cosmic symmetry that the poets would later call the wrath of the gods, but a modern economist might call the bankruptcy of an overextended state. They won the war, but they lost their civilization.
While the physical structures were crumbling, the culture was undergoing a strange mutation. With the kings dead and the palaces gone, there was no one left to pay the scribes. Writing died out. For nearly 400 years, the Greeks became an illiterate people. They lived in small, isolated villages, huddled around campfires, telling stories of a time when men were taller, gods walked the earth, and a great city called Troy once glittered on a hill. These stories became their only currency. In the absence of gold and law, the Greeks clung to the Iliad as a sort of cultural DNA. It reminded them of who they were supposed to be, even as they lived in the dirt. The hero became a myth, a distant ancestor whose exploits grew more exaggerated with every generation. They forgot how to build a dome or how to manage a harbor, but they never forgot how Achilles felt when he lost his friend. The Trojan War had become the anchor of their identity in an age of darkness. Elsewhere, in the quiet, dusty archives of the Hittite Empire, which was also collapsing in the east, a single scribe was recording the final mentions of a place they called Wilusa. To the Hittites, Troy wasn't a land of poetic heroes. It was a strategic, often annoying vassal state named Wilusa that sat at a critical trade junction.
Their records didn't mention a face that launched 1,000 ships. They mentioned trade disputes, broken treaties, and a troublesome leader named Alexandru, a name suspiciously similar to Alexander, the other name for Paris of Troy. As the Hittite capital of Hattusa was being abandoned and its clay tablets were being buried by the shifting sands, the real history of Troy was being lost. The Hittites were the last people who knew the Trojans as they actually were: merchants, diplomats, and survivors. When the Hittite Empire vanished, the historical Troy vanished with it, leaving only the poetic Troy behind. This is the strange transition point of our story. We are moving from a world of facts into a world of dreams. For centuries after the fires died out, anyone walking past the mound of Hisarlik, the real site of Troy, would have seen nothing but a grassy hill. Sheep grazed over the spot where Hector was dragged behind a chariot. The local peasants probably found bronze arrowheads in the dirt and thought they were dragon teeth or lightning bolts. The Greeks of the Dark Age had lost the how of their history, but they had kept the why. They didn't know how to build a palace, but they knew why a man might sacrifice everything for his honor. They became a people obsessed with the past because their present was so bleak. Every small village claimed to be the birthplace of a hero. If your village had a particularly large oak tree, you claimed Zeus had sat under it. If you found a deep cave, it was obviously the entrance to Hades. This period of silence was actually a period of deep cultural fermentation. Without the heavy hand of kings and tax collectors, the Greek language was changing. It was becoming more rhythmic, more suited for the songs of the wandering bards. These bards, the rhapsodies, were the human hard drives of the Dark Age. They carried thousands of lines of poetry in their heads, traveling from village to village, trading stories for a meal and a place to sleep. They were the ones who kept Troy alive. They added layers of drama, divine intervention, and impossible feats of strength to the original, grittier reality of the war. They turned a messy, failed military expedition into a cosmic struggle between fate and free will. While the Greeks were singing in the dark, the rest of the world was also shifting. The great powers were gone, leaving a vacuum that would eventually be filled by the iron-willed empires we discussed earlier. But for a few hundred years, the world was strangely quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the return of the light. Elsewhere, deep in the earth beneath the ruins of the Trojan citadel, a single golden earring lay trapped in the scorched clay, a silent witness to the layers of time. This piece of jewelry wasn't just gold, it was a physical marker of a tragedy that had been buried by 9 different versions of the same city. You see, Troy wasn't just one place, it was a vertical timeline. Every time the city was burned or shaken down by an earthquake, the survivors simply leveled the rubble and built a new Troy on top of the old one. By the time the Greek Dark Age was ending, the Troy of the war, which archaeologists usually call Troy 7A, was buried by meters of debris. The people living on top of it had no idea they were walking over the bedrooms of princes and the armories of kings. They were living in a stratigraphic amnesia, where the higher they built, the more they forgot about what lay beneath their feet. This era of forgetting began to change when the Greeks started to sail again. They were no longer the desperate refugees of the post-war collapse. They were becoming a new kind of explorer. As they pushed back into the coast of Asia Minor, they rediscovered the site of Troy. To them, it wasn't a historical site to be excavated, it was a holy place. They built a small temple to Athena on the mound, convinced that the goddess still lingered there, perhaps still nursing her old grudges against the city. Even the great leaders of later history couldn't resist the pull of the Trojan ghost. When Xerxes of Persia marched towards Greece centuries later, he stopped at Troy to sacrifice 1,000 oxen. He wanted to appease the spirits of the Trojans, viewing his invasion of Greece as a belated act of revenge for what Agamemnon had done. A few decades later, Alexander the Great did the exact same thing, but from the opposite perspective. He ran a lap around the supposed tomb of Achilles, traded his own shield for one kept in the local temple, and declared himself the new champion of the Greeks. They were all playing a game of historical role-playing. They used the myth of Troy to justify their own wars, turning a dead city into a political tool. The reality of the Bronze Age merchants and the Hittite treaties was completely replaced by the shadows of the heroic age. The mound of Hisarlik became a stage where every ambitious man in history came to audition for the role of the next Achilles.
But while the kings were busy sacrificing oxen, the earth was doing what it does best, accumulating dust. The harbor that had once held 1,000 Greek ships was slowly filling with silt from the Scamander River. The sea was retreating, moving the coastline kilometers away from the city walls. Troy was being stranded in the middle of a plain, disconnected from the water that had once been its lifeblood. The city was literally losing its place in the world. It was becoming a landlocked ghost, a destination for tourists and poets rather than sailors and kings. Elsewhere, in the busy markets of a growing city-state called Athens, a man was reciting a poem that would change the world. By the time the Greek Dark Age was ending, the Troy of the war, which archaeologists were now beginning to piece together through oral tradition, had become a foundational ghost. In the busy markets of a growing city-state called Athens, a man was reciting a poem that would change the world. This was the moment the Iliad was committed to the new Greek alphabet. No longer was the story a flickering memory held by a few traveling bards. It was now a physical, permanent record. But even then, the Greeks were not interested in archaeological truth. They didn't care about the height of the walls or the exact date of the fire. They cared about the psychology of the defeat. They wanted to know how a city that had survived for centuries could disappear in a single night of drunken celebration. The recitation of these poems became the cultural glue for the new Greek identity. At the great festivals, thousands would sit in silence as a rhapsode performed the deaths of Patroclus and Hector. It was a form of collective therapy for a people who were still, hundreds of years later, trying to process the collapse of their ancestors' world. They looked at Troy and saw a mirror of their own potential for self-destruction. This period marked the beginning of classical Troy. While the original city slept beneath the dirt, a new town called Ilion was built on top. It became a destination for the elite of the ancient world. It was the first theme park of history. Travelers would come to see the tomb of Ajax or the spring where Achilles washed. Enterprising locals would sell authentic relics, shards of pottery or rusty spearheads, claiming they had belonged to the heroes themselves.
But as the Roman Empire eventually rose and took over the site, the business of Troy became even more serious. The Romans, believing they were the descendants of Trojan Aeneas, treated the city like a sacred homeland. They exempted it from taxes. They poured money into its temples. They even considered moving the capital of the entire Roman Empire back to Troy, an idea that would have turned the site into a massive marble metropolis. But the geography wouldn't allow it. The Scamander River continued its relentless work of silting up the coast. The harbor was gone, replaced by a mosquito-infested marsh. Without a port, the city had no function. It was a museum in the middle of a swamp. When the Roman Empire eventually converted to Christianity, the pagan glamour of Troy began to feel dangerous and outdated. The temples were closed, the tourists stopped coming, and the site was slowly abandoned. By the 5th century AD, the walls that had resisted Agamemnon for 10 years were being pulled down by local farmers to build stone fences for their goats. The holy city of the ancient world was becoming a quarry. Elsewhere, in the cold, damp monasteries of Western Europe, a monk was carefully scratching the word Troy into a piece of vellum, wondering if such a place had ever truly existed. By this time, the physical city was gone, but the literary city was entering its most surreal phase. During the Middle Ages, the Iliad itself was largely lost to Western Europe because almost no one could read Greek anymore. Instead, they relied on Latin summaries and bizarre eyewitness accounts from people like Dares Phrygius, who claimed to have been a soldier in the war. These medieval versions of the story were completely unmoored from reality. In these books, Hector and Achilles were described as medieval knights in shining plate armor, living in a Troy that looked more like Paris or London than a Bronze Age citadel. The war became a series of chivalric tournaments and courtly romances. The tragedy of a dying civilization was replaced by the etiquette of the banquet hall. While the poets were busy turning Priam into a medieval duke, the actual site of Troy in Asia Minor was being claimed by the Byzantine Empire. They used the mound of Hisarlik as a minor military outpost, but the glory was gone. The grand temples had been replaced by small, austere churches. The stones were eroded by the wind and the salt spray from the Dardanelles. Eventually, even the Byzantines lost interest. After the Crusaders and the Ottoman Turks swept through the region, the location of the city was simply erased from human memory. For nearly 400 years, if you had asked a scholar where Troy was, they would have told you it was a philosophical location or a poetic invention. Some thought it was in England. Others thought it was just a metaphor for the struggle of the soul. The world had become so disconnected from its Bronze Age roots that the idea of a massive real war over a trade route felt less likely than a story about gods and goddesses. But then came the Age of Enlightenment. In the late 1700s, travelers began to return to the Troad, the region around the Dardanelles. They carried their copies of Homer like maps, trying to match the descriptions of the river and the hills to the actual landscape. They looked at the springs, the way the wind blew, and the distance from the sea. One man, Frank Calvert, a local official and amateur archaeologist, became convinced that a nondescript hill called Hisarlik was the spot. He didn't have the money to dig it up, but he had the intuition. He realized that the hill wasn't natural. It was too regular, too perfectly shaped to be anything other than a tell, a mound of human history stacked layer upon layer.
He was waiting for someone with enough obsession and enough money to prove him right. Elsewhere, in a small office in Germany, Heinrich Schliemann was growing up with a singular, almost feverish obsession. Schliemann was not a trained archaeologist. He was a businessman who had made a fortune in the California gold rush and through clever, sometimes ruthless trade during the Crimean War. He believed Homer wasn't a poet, but a journalist. To him, the Iliad was a treasure map. In 1871, Schliemann arrived at the mound of Hissarlik. While the academic world scoffed at his lack of credentials, he hired hundreds of local laborers and began to dig with the blunt force of a man possessed. He didn't use the delicate brushes and trowels of modern science. He used dynamite and massive trenches. In his haste to find the Troy of Priam, he committed one of the greatest archaeological crimes in history. He dug straight through the actual layers of the Trojan War, destroying them in his search for something deeper and older. But then he found it. In May 1873, near the base of a fortification wall, Schliemann saw a glimmer of gold in the dust. He dismissed his workers, claiming it was his birthday, and together with his wife, Sophia, he unearthed what he called Priam's treasure. It was a staggering collection: golden diadems, thousands of tiny gold rings, silver vases, and copper shields. He famously photographed Sophia wearing the jewels of Helen, a haunting image of a 19th century woman adorned in the finery of a ghost. The world was electrified. Schliemann had done the impossible. He had proven that the myth had a heartbeat. But there was a catch. Science eventually caught up with his enthusiasm. The gold he had found wasn't from the time of the Trojan War. It was from a lair 1,000 years older, a city that had existed long before Paris or Helen were even concepts. He had found a Troy, but not the Troy. However, the scandal of his methods didn't matter to the public imagination. The gates had been opened. The discovery sparked a global obsession with the Bronze Age. People realized that beneath the legends of gods and heroes lay a real, gritty, and technologically advanced world of trade and warfare. While Schliemann was celebrating his find, the gold itself began a new, strange journey. It was smuggled out of Turkey, donated to a museum in Berlin, and eventually disappeared during the chaos of World War II, only to resurface decades later in a secret vault in Russia. The gold of Troy, much like the city itself, seemed cursed to be a prize of war, looted and relocated time and time again. As the 19th century turned into the 20th, more careful archaeologists returned to the site. They began to sort through Schliemann's mess, carefully dating the pottery and the burn marks. They found evidence of a city that had been besieged, a city that had fallen to fire, and a city that had suffered through a massive earthquake. The real Troy was finally being rescued from the shadow of the myth. Elsewhere, in the quiet halls of a university, a new generation of linguists was looking at the Hittite tablets, finally connecting the dots between Wilusa and the legend. This was the moment where the poetic and the historical finally shook hands. By deciphering the cuneiform script of the Hittite Empire, the superpower that once controlled most of modern-day Turkey, scholars found the Manapa Tarhunta letter and the Tawagalawa letter.
These weren't poems, they were diplomatic headaches. They spoke of a city called Wilusa, which sounds remarkably like Ilios, the Greek name for Troy, that was constantly being fought over by the Hittites and a group of aggressive Westerners called the Achaeawa, a word linguistically linked to the Achaeans or the Greeks. This discovery turned the Trojan War from a romantic tragedy into a cold geopolitical reality. The war wasn't fought for the love of a queen, but for the control of the Hellespont, the narrow waterway that was the gateway to the Black Sea and its vast resources of grain, gold, and timber. Troy was the toll booth of the ancient world. If you wanted to trade, you had to deal with the Trojans. For the Greeks, 10 years of war was a small price to pay for the keys to the world's most profitable trade route. As we move into part 31, we enter the most mysterious phase of our journey, the anatomy of a siege. We often hear that the war lasted 10 years, but what does 10 years of war actually look like when the cameras aren't rolling? It wasn't 10 years of constant fighting. It was 10 years of boredom, camp fever, and the slow, grinding psychological warfare of two cultures staring at each other across a wall. The Greek camp was not a heroic fortress. It was a shanty town of rotting wood and damp sand. The soldiers spent more time fishing and raiding nearby villages for food than they did fighting at the gates of Troy. They became seasonal warriors, fighting in the dry months and trying to survive the damp, disease-ridden winters. The real enemy wasn't Hector's spear. It was the lack of clean water and the sheer mind-numbing repetition of the siege. Inside the city, the Trojans were suffering from a different kind of claustrophobia. They were rich in gold, but poor in space. The once grand boulevards were now crowded with refugees from the surrounding countryside. The air was thick with the smoke of communal fires and the tension of a population that knew their food supplies were dwindling. Every time a Greek ship appeared on the horizon with supplies, the city held its breath. This was a war of endurance, not just of heroes. It was a test of whose spirit would break first under the weight of time. Elsewhere, in the medical tents of the Greek camp, a healer named Mycenaean was trying to stop a strange new fever that had begun to spread among the men. While the Iliad attributes this plague to the silver arrows of Apollo, the reality likely was much more grounded in the grim biology of
a Bronze Age camp. 10,000 men living on a beach with no sanitation, drinking stagnant water from the Scamander marshes, and sharing space with livestock was a recipe for a biological disaster far more lethal than any Trojan sword. The plague was a turning point. It forced the Greeks to realize that time was no longer on their side. The siege had become a parasite, draining the life out of the besiegers as much as the besieged. Machaon and his brother Podalirius, sons of the god of medicine, Asclepius, were the first to witness the limitations of ancient science. They used honey to seal wounds and willow bark to dull pain, but against the invisible arrows of infection, they were powerless. This atmosphere of sickness and decay is what led to the famous anger of Achilles. When your friends are dying of fever and the sky is black with the smoke of funeral pyres, the ego of a king like Agamemnon becomes unbearable. The war had become a psychological pressure cooker. Inside Troy, The pressure was different, but equally suffocating. The Trojans weren't just fighting the Greeks, they were fighting the sunk cost fallacy. They had invested so much in this defense, lost so many sons, and endured so much hunger that surrendering Helen or the gold felt like a betrayal of their own suffering. They were trapped in a cycle where the only way to justify the past was to continue the destruction into the future. This is the hidden tragedy of the 10-year mark. The original cause of the war, a marriage dispute, had been completely eclipsed by the mechanics of the war itself. It was now a self-sustaining machine. The soldiers on both sides had more in common with each other than with the families they had left behind. They shared the same dust, the same flies, and the same looming sense of mortality. Meanwhile, back in the Greek islands, the home front was beginning to forget what the war was about. A new generation had grown up hearing only stories of the glory, unaware of the rot and the fever on the Trojan shore. They were the ones who would eventually inherit a broken world. Elsewhere, on a high cliff overlooking the Hellespont, a Trojan scout saw a single Greek ship being dragged out to sea, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope. But hope in the ancient world was often just the prelude to a more sophisticated trap. The Greeks knew they couldn't break the walls, so they had to break the Trojan mind. They played on the Trojans' deep religious devotion and their desperate need for the war to be over. They built a massive hollow structure, dedicated it to Athena, and left a defector named Scaean to tell a story so convincing that it bypassed the Trojans' natural suspicion. Scaean told the Trojans that the horse was an offering to ensure a safe voyage home for the Greeks, and that if the Trojans brought it inside their walls, the favor of the gods would shift to Troy forever. It was the ultimate clickbait of the ancient world. The Trojans, led by the belief that they had finally won, tore down a section of their own invincible walls to drag the horse inside. They didn't just let the enemy in, they destroyed their own defenses to facilitate it. That night, Troy experienced a phenomenon known as victory fatigue. For the first time in a decade, the guards stood down. The wine flowed, the music played, and the city fell into a deep, vulnerable sleep. It was the silence of a tomb. Inside the belly of the horse, Odysseus and his men sat in total darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of the Trojan celebration. They weren't heroes in that moment, they were assassins, waiting for the signal to end an entire culture. When the signal fire was finally lit from the tomb of Achilles, the men inside the horse descended. They didn't fight a battle, they conducted an execution. They opened the gates for the rest of the Greek army, which had sailed back under the cover of a moonless night. The war of heroes ended not with a duel in the sun, but with a knife in the dark. The fire that started in the lower districts of the city spread rapidly. Troy was built to trap heat and keep out the wind, which now made it a perfect furnace. As the timber roofs collapsed and the gold melted into the cracks of the stone floors, the Trojans woke up to a world that was literally melting around them. The massacre that followed was so brutal that even the Greek poets later seemed ashamed of it. They told stories of Priam being murdered at his own altar and of children being thrown from the battlements. It was the unmaking of a world.
The city that had been the jewel of the East was reduced to a blackened shell in less than 12 hours. Elsewhere, in the chaotic, smoke-filled streets, Aeneas was living through a nightmare that would eventually become the foundation of Rome. According to the legend, his mother, the goddess Aphrodite, whispered to him that Troy was already a corpse and there was no honor to dying for a ghost. Aeneas represents a new kind of hero, the survivor. He wasn't like Achilles, who lived for a glorious death. Aeneas lived for a future he couldn't yet see. As he fled the burning city, he carried the Penates, the small wooden household gods of Troy. This is a crucial detail. It tells us that while the walls were falling and the gold was being looted, the soul of the city was being packed into a crate and carried away. The Greeks won the land, but the Trojans kept the identity. Behind him, the city was undergoing a process of thermal destruction. The fire was so intense that it changed the chemistry of the limestone walls, turning them into soft, crumbly powder. The great Scaean Gate, which had stood against 1,000 Greek assaults, simply warped and buckled under the heat. The smoke was visible as far away as the islands of Lemnos and Imbros, a black pillar of ash that signaled the official end of the Bronze Age power structure in Asia Minor.
The Greeks, now fueled by a decade of pent-up frustration and the madness of victory, didn't just take the wealth, they systematically smashed what they couldn't carry. They broke the looms, shattered the storage jars, and slaughtered the horses in the royal stables. It was an act of cultural erasure. They wanted to make sure that when they left, there would be nothing for the survivors to return to. As the sun rose over the smoking mound of Hisarlik, the Greek fleet began the long process of loading their ships. The 1,000 ships were now battered, barnacle-encrusted hulks, burdened with heavy crates of Trojan silver, and the thousands of women and children who had been spared only for a life of slavery. The shore, which for 10 years had been a bustling city of soldiers, was suddenly empty, save for the thousands of funeral pyres that were still smoldering. The Greeks had what they wanted. The gold was in the holds, and the honor was restored. But as they looked back at the ruined city from the decks of their ships, the feeling wasn't one of joy. It was a hollow, exhausted silence. They were returning to a Greece that had moved on without them, carrying the weight of a massacre that would haunt their poetry for the next 3,000 years. The war was over, but the return, the Nostos, was just beginning. And as Odysseus looked at the horizon, he had no idea that it would take him another 10 years of wandering through the monsters and the shadows of his own mind before he would see his home again. Elsewhere, on the deserted beach of Troy, the local scavengers began to pick through the cooling ashes, looking for anything the heroes had missed. These were the people history usually forgets: the farmers from the slopes of Mount Ida, the shepherds, and the runaway slaves who had hidden in the hills while the city burned. For them, the Great War was simply a 10-year natural disaster that had finally moved on. They found broken bronze tripod legs, scorched loom weights, and perhaps a few stray beads of carnelian or amber dropped in the mud. But the most valuable thing left behind wasn't gold, it was the timber. The Greeks, in their hurry to leave, had abandoned some of their siege works and broken ship hulls.
In a landscape where the forests had been leveled to feed funeral pyres and campfires for a decade, wood was more precious than silver. As these survivors began to build small, pathetic shelters among the ruins, a strange biological phenomenon was taking place. Without the constant presence of 10,000 soldiers and the smoke of a city, the ecosystem of the Scamander Plain began to reset itself. The birds returned to the marshes. The wild boars came down from the mountains to root through the abandoned Greek store pits. The earth was indifferent to the fall of Priam. It was simply absorbing the carbon of the city back into the soil. Meanwhile, the great diaspora was in full swing. Aeneas was not the only one who fled. Groups of Trojan survivors were scattering in every direction, some to Italy, some to Sicily, and some back into the interior of Anatolia. They carried with them a very specific type of refugee culture. They were a people defined by what they had lost. This sense of longing for a lost home, became a recurring theme in the history of the Mediterranean. Back in the Greek world, the homecomings were proving to be more dangerous than the war itself. Agamemnon, the king of men, arrived in Mycenaean with his chariots full of gold and his captive priestess Cassandra. He expected a hero's welcome. Instead, he found a red carpet that led straight to his own murder. His wife, Clytemnestra, had spent 10 years nursing a grudge for the daughter he sacrificed to get the ships moving in the first place. The death of Agamemnon in his bathtub, hacked down while entangled in a heavy robe, was the final insult to the heroic age. He had survived Hector, the plague, and the wrath of the gods, only to be killed by his own family in his own house. It signaled that the old social structures, where a king's word was law and his person was sacred, were completely shattered. The Mycenaean world was collapsing into a war of cousins. Every palace was suddenly a scene of betrayal. The wealth of Troy didn't bring prosperity. It brought greed, paranoia, and blood feuds that would last for generations. Elsewhere, on a lonely beach in the middle of a wine-dark sea, Odysseus sat on a beach and wept. The man of many wiles was now the man of many sorrows. His journey home, the Odyssey, would become the ultimate metaphor for the human condition, the struggle to find one's way back to a place that has already changed in your absence. While the Iliad was about the fire of war, the Odyssey was about the cold reality of the aftermath. Odysseus encountered monsters like the Cyclops and the Sirens, but these were often interpreted by later scholars as the psychological demons of a soldier suffering from what we now call PTSD. The giants he fought weren't just mythical creatures, they were the personifications of the lawless, chaotic world that the fall of Troy had left behind. While Odysseus was lost at sea, the Greek mainland was entering its final Mycenaean stage. The palaces were becoming fortresses of paranoia. Archaeologists have found that in the years following the Trojan War, cities like Mycenaean and Tiryns began building massive cyclopean walls and secret underground cisterns to store water. They weren't preparing for a glorious war abroad, they were preparing for a siege at home. They knew the sea peoples and the northern tribes were coming, and they knew their exhausted soldiers couldn't stop them. The economy of the Bronze Age was a delicate web of gift exchange between kings. When Troy fell, it didn't just remove a city, it broke a link in the chain. The trade routes for tin, essential for making bronze, began to dry up. Without tin, the Bronze Age literally ground to a halt. It's no coincidence that iron begins to appear in the archaeological record at exactly this time. Iron was harder to work with, but easier to find. It was the democratic metal. It allowed smaller tribes to arm themselves against the elite chariot warriors of the Old World.
This transition was violent. One by one, the great centers of the Mediterranean went dark. Hattusa in the east, Mycenaean in the west, and the cities of the Levant were all burned. This wasn't a coordinated invasion, but a domino effect of systemic failure. Poverty led to migration, migration led to conflict, and conflict led to the total collapse of the palace bureaucracies. By the time Odysseus finally reached the shores of Ithaca, he didn't return as a king in a golden chariot. He returned as a beggar, unrecognizable even to his own dog. He had to fight one last war in his own dining hall to reclaim his wife and his throne. It was a small, dirty, and personal battle, a far cry from the sweeping plains of Troy. It showed that the era of the great king was over. It was now every man for himself in a world that had forgotten how to be civil. As Odysseus finally settled into his bed, the fires of the Bronze Age were flickering out across the entire horizon. The silence of the Dark Age was about to begin. Elsewhere, in the ruins of the Hittite Empire, a group of people were moving toward the coast of Canaan, carrying with them the secret of ironworking and a deep-seated grudge against the world they left behind. These were the Philistines, or the Peliset, as the Egyptians called them. Like the Trojans and the Greeks, they were the displaced orphans of the Bronze Age collapse. They brought with them Aegean-style pottery and a military discipline that would soon clash with the rising tribes of Israel. The world was no longer a place of grand alliances. It was a patchwork of survival. While the Philistines were settling on the coast, the Dark Age of Greece was deepening. This wasn't just a lack of gold, it was a lack of memory. Without writing, the complicated genealogies of the kings who fought at Troy began to blur. The specific details of the war, the tax rates, the logistics, the names of the minor captains evaporated, leaving only the heroic highlights. In this silence, the geography of the world changed. The great roads built for Mycenaean chariots were reclaimed by the forest. The harbors that once welcomed ships from Egypt and Cyprus became choked with silt. Population levels plummeted. In some parts of Greece, the number of inhabited sites dropped by 80%. It was as if humanity had decided to go into hibernation, exhausted by the centuries of struggle. But even in this hibernation, the ghost of Troy was at work. In the small, isolated hamlets, people still gathered around the hearth to hear the songs of the ancestors. These songs were the only thing that gave their lives a sense of scale. They might be living in a mud brick hut, but they believed they were the grandchildren of men who had defied the gods. This belief was the pilot light that kept the Greek spirit from going out completely. While Greece was in its slumber, the civilizations of the East were also resetting. The Neo-Assyrians were beginning to stir in Mesopotamia, developing a form of warfare that was even more brutal than the Greek phalanx. They didn't care about honor or heroic duels. They cared about the total psychological submission of their enemies. They were the first to turn the terror of the Bronze Age collapse into a deliberate state policy. In Egypt, the new kingdom was a memory. The pharaohs were now priests or foreign Libyan generals trying to hold on to the prestige of the past, while the gold of the pyramids was being systematically looted by the very people paid to guard them. Egypt was becoming a land of tombs, a civilization that spent more energy on the dead than the living. The world was waiting for a new spark, and that spark would come from the most unlikely of places, the alphabet. A small group of seafaring merchants called the Phoenicians, the descendants of the old Canaanite sailors, were developing a script that would allow anyone, not just a professional scribe, to record the world. This invention would eventually allow the stories of Troy to be captured in ink, ensuring they could never be forgotten again. Elsewhere, on a small rocky island in the Aegean, a group of refugees found a hidden spring and decided to build a new life, unaware that their descendants would one day call themselves Spartans. They were the Dorians we spoke of earlier, but they were changing. In the harsh landscape of the Peloponnese, they were forging a society that rejected the luxury of Troy and the complexity of Mycenaean. They looked at the ruins of the old world and decided that walls made of stone were useless. They would build walls of men. This was the birth of the Laconian lifestyle. While the rest of the world eventually returned to gold and trade, the Spartans stayed in a state of permanent mobilization. They believed that the fall of Troy happened because the Trojans had become soft and the Greeks had become disorganized. To prevent a repeat of history, they created a system of discipline so absolute that it turned every citizen into a living weapon. While Sparta was hardening into a military machine, the city of Athens was moving in the opposite direction. They were looking toward the sea. They realized that the real power of the ancient world hadn't been the land, but the trade routes that Troy once controlled. They began to build a navy, not for a single 10-year war, but for a permanent empire of commerce. They were the intellectual heirs of Odysseus, cunning, adaptable, and always looking for a way to turn a profit out of a crisis. As these city-states grew, they began to look back at the Trojan War as their moral compass. Every 4 years they would stop their local bickering to gather at Olympia. There they competed in the name of the same gods who had watched the walls of Troy burn. The Olympic Games were a way to ritualize the violence of the Bronze Age, turning the slaughter of the battlefield into the theater of the stadium. It was a sign that the Dark Age was truly over. The Greeks were finally comfortable enough to play with the idea of war without actually destroying their civilization.
But the ghost of Troy wasn't just in Greece. In Italy, the descendants of Aeneas, those Trojan refugees who had escaped the flames, were busy building a small village on 7 hills. They called it Rome. At first, it was just a collection of huts and mud walls, a place for outcasts and runaway shepherds. But they carried with them the Trojan chip on the shoulder. They believed they were destined for greatness because they had survived the greatest catastrophe in history. The Romans didn't have the poetic flair of the Greeks, but they had the Trojan stubbornness. They didn't want to sing about heroes. They wanted to build an empire that would never fall. They looked at the story of the wooden horse not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in security. They became obsessed with walls, with laws, and with the idea of the state. If the Greeks were the sons of Achilles, the Romans were the sons of Hector, determined to protect their city at any cost. The Mediterranean was becoming a crowded place again. The silence of the 10th century BC was being replaced by the noise of 100 competing city-states. The memory of Troy had shifted from a painful scar to a proud badge of honor. Everyone wanted a piece of the legend. Elsewhere, in the mountains of Persia, a new kind of king was looking at a map and realizing that the distance between east and west was much smaller than anyone had imagined. This was Cyrus the Great, and later the mighty Darius. To the Persians, the old stories of the Trojan War were curious artifacts of a primitive age. They didn't see the Greeks as heroic descendants of Achilles. They saw them as a collection of disorganized, quarrelsome tribes inhabiting a rocky, unimportant fringe of the world. The Persians were the first to truly master the imperial perspective. While the Greeks were still thinking in terms of city-states and local honor, the Persians were thinking in terms of continents. They built the Royal Road, a 1,600-mile highway that connected the heart of Asia to the coast of the Aegean. For the first time since the fall of Troy, the trade routes were not just open, they were regulated by a single massive bureaucracy. This brought the ghost of Troy into a new, dangerous light. The Persian Empire eventually absorbed the Greek cities of Ionia, the very coastline where Troy had once stood. Suddenly, the descendants of the Greeks were subjects of an Eastern king. This triggered a deep ancestral anxiety. To the Greeks, this wasn't just a political occupation. It felt like the Trojan War in reverse. It was the East coming to conquer the West. The conflict that followed, the Persian Wars, was framed by the Greeks as a sequel to the Iliad. When the Persian king Xerxes stood at the Hellespont in 480 BC, he didn't just see a body of water. He saw the place where Agamemnon's fleet had once gathered. He reportedly made a pilgrimage to the ruins of Troy, offering sacrifices to the spirits of the Trojans. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. He was telling the Greeks, "I am the heir of Priam, and I have come to collect the debt." The Greeks responded with a desperate, unified fury. At the battles of Marathon and later at Salamis, they weren't just fighting for their soil. They were fighting to prove that the age of heroes wasn't over. They used the memory of Troy as a shield. The victory of the Greeks over the Persians was seen as a second fall of the East. It solidified the idea that Europe and Asia were fundamentally different worlds, destined to clash forever. But as the Persian threat receded, the Greeks did what they always did. They turned on each other. The Peloponnesian War broke out, pitting Athens against Sparta. It was a war of such staggering bitterness that the historian Thucydides noted it made the Trojan War look like a minor skirmish. The Greeks were dismantling their own golden age with the same efficiency they had used to dismantle Troy. While the Greeks were bleeding themselves dry, the Romans in the West were quietly growing. They were no longer a village of shepherds. They were a republic of iron-disciplined soldiers and cold-eyed lawyers. They watched the Greek civil wars with the patience of a predator. They were the new Trojans, and they were waiting for their moment to reclaim the world. The stage was being set for a final massive consolidation. The fragmented pieces of the Bronze Age, the Greek city-states, and the Persian satrapies were all about to be swallowed by a single unified Mediterranean system. The many wiles of Odysseus were about to be replaced by the many legions of Rome. Elsewhere, in the humid, gold-rich valley of the Nile, the last of the pharaohs were watching the horizon, realizing that the ancient protection of the desert was no longer enough to keep the modern world away. Egypt had always been the old man of the Mediterranean. the civilization that saw Troy rise, fall, and turn to dust while they were still building the same style of temples. But by the 4th century BC, the weight of their own history was becoming a burden. They were no longer the conquerors, they were the ultimate prize. The world was about to be unified by a man who obsessed over the Iliad more than any person in history: Alexander the Great. Alexander didn't just read the story of Troy, he lived in its shadow. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, edited by his tutor Aristotle, and he truly believed he was the rightful heir to Achilles. When he crossed into Asia in 334 BC, his first stop wasn't a strategic military base, but the mound of Troy. He ran naked around the tomb of Achilles, offered sacrifices at the temple of Athena, and traded his own armor for a sacred shield said to be from the Trojan War. For Alexander, his entire invasion of Persia was a Trojan War too. He was the new Greek champion, finishing the job Agamemnon had started 1,000 years earlier.
Alexander's conquest did something the Trojan War never could. It fused the East and the West. He founded dozens of cities, often naming them after himself, and filled them with Greek soldiers, theaters, and libraries. From the Mediterranean to the mountains of Afghanistan, the Greek language became the lingua franca. The stories of Troy were no longer just Greek heritage. They were becoming the global standard for literature. But Alexander, like the heroes of Troy, was a flash of fire that burned out too quickly. He died in Babylon at 32, leaving his empire to be carved up by his generals. These successor kingdoms turned the world into a sophisticated, violent, and highly scientific playground. They built the Lighthouse of Alexandria and the Great Library, where scholars worked tirelessly to organize the messy oral traditions of the Trojan cycle into the definitive texts we read today. While the Greek kings in the East were busy building libraries and fighting for Alexander's crown, the Romans in the West were perfecting a very different kind of power. They were no longer the new Trojans in metaphor only. They were starting to believe it as historical fact. They adopted the Greek gods but gave them Roman names. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, and they reimagined the fall of Troy not as a Greek victory, but as a Roman origin story. They commissioned the poet Virgil to write the Aeneid, an epic that bridged the gap between the burning ruins of Troy and the marble streets of Rome. In this version, the Greeks weren't the heroes, they were the treacherous villains who used a dishonorable wooden horse to win a war they couldn't win on the battlefield. The Trojans, led by Aeneas, were the virtuous survivors who brought their gods and their values to Italy to found a greater Troy. This was the ultimate historical pivot. By claiming Trojan ancestry, Rome gave itself a prehistory that was older and more prestigious than the Greek city-states they were about to conquer. It was a way of saying, you may have burned our city once, but we have returned to rule yours. Elsewhere, in the harbors of Carthage, the descendants of the Phoenician sea lords were watching the Roman expansion with a sense of impending doom. They realized that the Mediterranean was no longer the vast, open frontier it had been after the Bronze Age collapse. It was becoming a crowded arena where only one superpower could survive. The struggle between Rome and Carthage, the Punic Wars, was, in many ways, the third act of the Trojan drama. According to Virgil's epic, when Aeneas fled Troy, he stopped in Carthage and broke the heart of its queen, Dido.
As she climbed her funeral pyre, she cursed his descendants, swearing that there would be eternal enmity between their two nations. To the Romans, fighting Hannibal wasn't just a matter of territory, it was the fulfillment of an ancient, tragic destiny. Hannibal's invasion of Italy was the closest Rome ever came to suffering the fate of Troy. For 15 years, the ghost of Troy hovered over the Roman Senate as they watched their armies being slaughtered. But unlike the Trojans, the Romans had a political system that was built for endurance. They didn't rely on a single wall or a single hero like Hector. They relied on an inexhaustible supply of citizens who refused to admit they were beaten. When Carthage finally fell in 146 BC, the Romans didn't just win, they performed a ritual of erasure that made the Greek sack of Troy look merciful. They burned the city to the ground, sold every survivor into slavery, and, legend has it, plowed salt into the earth. They wanted to ensure that this new Troy would never rise again. With the West secured, the Romans turned their attention back to Greece. The sons of Aeneas finally returned to the land of their conquerors, but this time they came as masters. One by one, the famous city-states, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, fell under the Roman shadow. The Romans were fascinated by Greek culture, but unimpressed by Greek politics. They looted the statues of the gods from the Greek temples and brought them back to Rome, effectively kidnapping the culture that had once destroyed their ancestors. This created a strange hybrid world called Greco-Roman civilization. The stories of Troy were no longer the property of a single people, they were the foundation of a global empire. A Roman child in Spain and a Greek child in Egypt would both grow up reading about the rage of Achilles and the wandering of Odysseus. The fall had become a foundation. But as Rome grew into a massive, bloated empire, it began to suffer from the same diseases that killed the Bronze Age: overexpansion, economic inequality, and a military that was more loyal to its generals than to its state. The Roman emperors, from Augustus to Nero, played the role of new Trojan kings, living in palaces that made Priams look like a hut. But beneath the marble, the foundations were cracking. The Sea Peoples were returning, but this time they were coming from the north and the east, tribes of Goths, Vandals, and Huns who didn't care about the poetry of Homer or the laws of Virgil. They only cared that the Roman walls were becoming thin and the Roman gold was becoming soft. Elsewhere, in a small provincial town in Judea, a new movement was starting that would eventually replace the Olympian gods with a single, humble carpenter. This was a shift that would change the meaning of victory and defeat forever. For over 1,000 years, the Trojan War had been the moral compass of the world, a story of pride, bronze, and the capricious whims of the gods. But as Christianity began to spread through the Roman Empire, the narrative of the heroic age began to look like a collection of beautiful but empty lies. The new faith didn't value the rage of Achilles or the wiles of Odysseus. It valued humility, sacrifice, and a world beyond the physical. To the early Christians, the fall of Troy wasn't a tragedy of fate, it was a symptom of a pagan world that had lost its way. The temples of Apollo and Athena, which had stood as silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires, were slowly being repurposed. The marble of the old world was being ground down to make mortar for the new. By the 4th century AD, the Emperor Constantine had moved the center of gravity from Rome to Constantinople. This was a strategic masterstroke. Constantinople sat exactly where the worlds of East and West met, just across the water from the ruins of Troy. It was as if the empire had decided to return to its roots, building a new Rome on the very shores where the ancient Greeks had once pitched their tents. But this new empire, Byzantium, was a strange, gilded cage. It was Christian in soul, but Roman in its bones, and Greek in its tongue. They still kept the scrolls of Homer in their libraries, but they read them as historical curiosities rather than sacred texts. The Trojan War had finally become academic. It was something for scholars to argue about in the safety of a walled city, while outside, the world was becoming increasingly chaotic. The Great Collapse was coming for the Romans just as it had for the Mycenaeans. The borders of the Rhine and the Danube were being breached by Germanic tribes. These tribes, the Goths and the Vandals, were the new sea peoples. They didn't have the sophisticated siege engines of the Greeks, but they had the advantage of a crumbling Roman economy. The Roman system had become so heavy and so expensive that it could no longer pay its own soldiers to protect its own people. In 410 AD, when the Visigoths sacked Rome, the shock was felt all the way to the edges of the known world. It was the fall of Troy all over again, but on a much larger scale. The eternal city was no longer eternal. The refugees fleeing the smoke of Rome carried the same look in their eyes that Aeneas had once carried, a mixture of disbelief and the desperate need to survive. The world was entering a long, cold twilight. The light of the ancient Mediterranean was fading, replaced by the fragmented, localized power of the Middle Ages. The trade routes that had once connected Troy to Egypt and Rome to London were being cut by pirates and warlords. The global world was becoming local again. But even in the dark, the fire of Troy refused to go out completely. In the monasteries of Ireland and the courts of the Frankish kings, the story of the wooden horse survived. It became a fairy tale, a legend for a world that had forgotten how to build a trireme or how to smelt bronze on an industrial scale. Elsewhere, in the deserts of Arabia, a new power was rising with a speed that would make Alexander the Great look slow, a power that would finally sweep away the last remnants of the old Roman and Persian systems. By the 7th century, the Islamic caliphates had surged out of the peninsula, fueled by a singular faith and a mastery of desert warfare. Within a generation, they had claimed the Levant, Egypt, and the Persian heartland. The map was being redrawn yet again. The Byzantines, who considered themselves the rightful heirs to the world of Troy and Rome, were pushed back to the walls of Constantinople. The region where Troy once stood, the Troad, became a militarized border zone, a no-man's land between the cross and the crescent. During this time, the actual site of Troy fell into a deep, literal slumber. The ruins were buried under layers of sediment and wild vegetation. To the Byzantine soldiers patrolling the coast, the mound was just a landmark. To the Arab sailors passing through the Dardanelles, it was a ghost of a dead empire. The intellectual center of the world had shifted to Baghdad, where scholars were translating the works of Aristotle and Plato. However, they were more interested in Greek philosophy and science than in the pagan poetry of the Trojan War. But while the East was focused on logic, the West was reinventing the legend of Troy to suit a new era of knights and castles. By the 12th century, the matter of Rome, which included the stories of Aeneas and the Greeks, became the bedrock of European literature. But there was a twist. The European nobility started claiming Trojan ancestry for themselves. The kings of France, the rulers of Britain, and even the Germanic tribes began to weave genealogies that linked their houses to the survivors of Troy. To them, Troy was the ultimate noble origin. Being a descendant of Hector was a more prestigious pedigree than being a descendant of the treacherous Greeks. This was the final irony. The victims of the war became the ancestors of choice for the most powerful men in Europe. The defeated Trojans had won the cultural war of the Middle Ages. While the poets were busy inventing Trojan lineages for French dukes, the physical world was preparing for the final act of the medieval drama. In 1453, the walls of Constantinople, the new Rome, finally fell to the cannons of the Ottoman Turks. Sultan Mehmed II, after taking the city, reportedly visited the site of Troy. Looking at the ruins, he is said to have remarked that he had finally avenged the Trojans by conquering the Greeks. The wheel of history had come to full circle. The East had returned to claim the West's last holding, and they used the memory of a 3,000-year-old war to justify it. The site of Troy was now firmly within the Ottoman Empire, where it would remain, quiet and undisturbed, until the shovels of the 19th century archaeologists arrived to wake it up. As we reach the final chapters of our journey, we move from the history of the site to the evolution of the myth. Why does this story still matter? Why do we still use terms like Trojan horse, Achilles' heel, and siren song in an age of silicon and satellites? Elsewhere, in a modern laboratory, a scientist is looking at a microscopic strand of DNA, realizing that the story of human migration is written in our genes as clearly as it was written on the clay tablets of Wilusa. Modern genomic studies of the Mediterranean basin have revealed that the sea peoples and the refugees of the Bronze Age collapse didn't just disappear into the mist of myth. They left a genetic signature, a trail of breadcrumbs that proves the massive displacements following the fall of Troy actually happened.
We are now in the age of archaeogenetics. We can see the DNA of Trojan-like populations appearing in Italy at exactly the time the legend of Aeneas says they arrived. We can see the movement of northern tribes into Greece, confirming the Dorian invasion was more than just a campfire story. The myth, it turns out, was a poetic way of recording a biological reality. But the legacy of Troy has moved beyond the dirt and the blood. It has become a psychological framework for how we understand conflict. In the 20th century, as two world wars tore across the same European soil that the Romans and Greeks once fought over, thinkers like Simone Weil and Rachel Bespaloff turned back to the Iliad. They saw it not as a celebration of war, but as the world's first great work of pacifist literature. They realized that Homer's true genius wasn't in picking a side. The Iliad is unique because it treats the enemy with the same dignity as the hero. We feel the grief of the Trojan king Priam as much as we feel the rage of the Greek Achilles. This radical empathy is what has kept the story alive through the Crusades, the empires, and the Cold War. It teaches us that in total war, there are no true victors, only survivors who carry the same heavy trauma. In our digital age, the Trojan horse has moved from the battlefield to our hard drives. The term has been repurposed as a metaphor for the vulnerabilities of our interconnected world, a reminder that the greatest threats often come from within, disguised as gifts or necessities. Our modern walls are made of encryption and firewalls, but the logic remains the same as it was at the Scaean Gate. If you let the wrong thing in,
the fortress falls in a single night. As we look toward the future, the mound of Hisarlik stands as a quiet monument to the cycle of empire. It reminds us that no city is eternal, no trade route is guaranteed, and no superpower is immune to the logic of the irrational. The 9 layers of Troy are a vertical cemetery of human ambition, stacked one on top of the other, waiting for the next layer of dust to settle. The story of Troy began with a golden apple and ended with a burning city. But its real ending is written in us, in our laws, our literature, our genes, and our fundamental understanding of what it means to be human in a world that is constantly breaking and rebuilding itself. Elsewhere, in a quiet classroom, a student opens a book and reads the first line of a poem written 3,000 years ago, and for a moment, the walls of the city are standing once again. This concludes our journey through the layers of Troy. Would you like me to summarize the key archaeological differences between the 9 layers of Troy, or perhaps explore the specific historical evidence for the sea peoples who triggered the final collapse? In the sterile silence of a modern laboratory, a scientist peers at a strand of DNA that reveals a new dimension to the Trojan story. Modern archaeogenetics tells us that the great collapse of the Bronze Age was not just a myth. By analyzing the genetic map of the Mediterranean, we find that the massive migrations following the fall of Troy left a permanent mark on the bloodlines of Italians, Greeks, and Turks. The legend of Aeneas leading survivors to Italy matches a biological reality. Troy burned, but its people survived, weaving themselves into the fabric of future civilizations. The battlefield has shifted from the plains of Scamander to our computer screens. The Trojan horse is no longer a wooden structure, but the most famous metaphor in cyber warfare. Whenever we download a file thinking it is a gift, only to have it dismantle our security from within, we repeat the mistake of the Trojans. Troy taught us that even the strongest walls are useless if you invite the enemy inside. It is no longer history, it is a warning for the digital age. When the 20th century witnessed the devastation of 2 world wars, thinkers like Simone Weil returned to the Iliad. They realized that Homer's epic wasn't a glorification of war, but a document of its horror. In the Trojan War, no one truly won. Achilles lost his soul, Priam lost his sons, and the Greeks returned home to find their own kingdoms in ruins. Troy teaches us that total war has no victors, only survivors who carry the same heavy trauma. Throughout history, rulers have used Troy to justify their power. From Alexander the Great to the Roman emperors, and even Sultan Mehmed II, Troy has been a key to political legitimacy. Even today, when a superpower besieges a rival or uses Trojan strategies in diplomacy, they are looking into the mirror of Troy. Every nation sees its own ambitions and its potential downfall in the reflection of those ancient walls. If you stand on the mound of Hisarlik today, 9 different versions of Troy lie beneath your feet. Digging just a few feet down reveals Roman coins, deeper still, Greek pottery, and at the bottom, the scorched earth of the Bronze Age. These layers remind us that no empire is eternal. Every great city of today may eventually become just an inch of dust for the archaeologists of the future. The bronze swords have long since rusted away, but Homer's words remain. From Renaissance paintings to modern cinema, Troy is an inseparable part of our imagination. History proves that words are more durable than stone or metal. Troy lives on not because of its walls, but because its story captures the most fundamental human emotions: love, greed, pride, and the desperate struggle for honor. As we reach the end, we realize that Troy is not just a place, it is a concept. It reminds us that human ambition can touch the stars, but a single mistake or act of hubris can turn it all to ash. 10 years of war, 1,000 ships, and countless lives. In the end, what remains is a long historical sigh.
We began with a golden apple and a quarrel between goddesses, and we conclude with a deep philosophical truth. Troy teaches us that history is not a straight line, but a circle. We build, we fight, we fall, and we begin again. The dust of Troy is now silent, but the wooden horse still wanders within the human mind. Whenever you face a difficult choice or stand at the peak of success, remember, beneath your feet, 9 cities are waiting to tell you their story. The end. This document tracks the journey of a civilization that fell 3,000 years ago but continues to define our understanding of heroism, betrayal, and resilience.